Okay, welcome to the facilities discussion. We have seven board members present. And could we please rise for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, this is our third meeting to discuss facilities, and I'm going to let Dave kick off the meeting.
Okay, good morning, and thanks everybody for coming out, including our support people from various different agencies, Raymond James, White, ICI, people, a lot of people, I know board members and consultants alike have rearranged schedules to try to make this happen today, so thank you very much. I just wanted to start out, I know that we're keeping this relatively informal. We do have the presentations keyed up to refer back to. We do have some different types of slides that can show examples of learning spaces or other different types of things like that that we could also refer to. But generally, we're trying to keep this somewhat informal. So the topical outline that I put by your tables was just to kind of encapsulate what I thought some of the big areas were. There's no magic about that or no set agenda per se. The only thing I did want to do, though, before we get into that, is I thought that it was important to start out with some information as to how did these initial draft concepts come to be in the first place, and really the way that materialized was that all-day kindergarten was kind of driving some of the conversation. And so when we got community feedback and people were suggesting that they're not real keen on grade level centers, they're not real keen on an all-day kindergarten center, they really would like to have all-day kindergarten at their neighborhood schools. That ended up driving a lot of the planning as to how some of these initial draft concepts came to be, and the various variables that had to be taken into account to accommodate that under that under those parameters really are how this first blush of ideas came to be. And so I just thought I would say that it doesn't mean the safety and security needs or the other basic infrastructure or equity types of needs that we've talked about aren't important, but they came to be in the concept of how do we do those things with the ability to accommodate all-day kindergarten in a neighborhood school type of setting. So with that, I guess I will leave it to you. I know some of you sent some questions in advance, and I have a little synopsis that I put at your table addressing some of those ideas, just so that there's a reference point, but we can go however you would like at this point.
Okay,
I didn't see that,
yeah, right. I just picked up the list for public comments. We had two people sign up for public comments, and I'd like to do that now. Barbara Longergan. And we ask that you speak for up to 3 minutes. Thank you.
My name is Barbara Lonergan, and I'm here representing the Elmhurst Cool Cities Coalition, a volunteer organization promoting environmentally sustainable solutions in the community through education, outreach, and community action. Our members include Elmhurst residents and Elmhurst institutions, including the library, the college, the Park District, and the City of Elmhurst. District 205 participated with our group for several years, but hasn't had representation in the coalition for more than 2 years. We'd like to share our perspective about the opportunities we see for District 205 to incorporate sustainability into the long-term facilities plan and the benefits green schools provide. According to the Center for Green Schools, sustainable schools save money, improve learning, increase teacher retention, improve community sustainability, and reduce the impact on our environment without incurring additional costs over traditional learning environments. Green schools use 30% less energy and water than conventionally constructed schools, significantly reducing utility costs over the average life cycle of a school. Green schools improve students' scholastic performance. Indoor air quality, acoustics, thermal comfort, natural light all impact students' health, attention span, focus, and memory. Teachers in green schools report that they are more satisfied in their environments than teachers in conventional schools, which helps to improve teacher retention. Green schools can bring a community together. By inviting the community to be a part of the collaborative process, a green school can become a source of civic pride, as well as a driver of encouraging community members to increase their own sustainability efforts. Green schools reduce the demand on municipal infrastructure, lessen our reliance on fossil fuels, and decreases carbon dioxide emissions and other forms of pollution. LEED certified buildings do not need to cost more than regular buildings if a school is working with an experienced team using integrative design principles. A typical LEED certified school could save $100,000 per year, enough to hire at least one new teacher, buy 200 new computers, or purchase 5,000 textbooks. Green schools do not necessarily require starting from scratch. In fact, cost-effective reuse and adaptation of existing facilities reduces landfill waste and avoids the energy and cost of extracting or harvesting new natural resources. Whether District 205 plans to sustainably reuse and improve upon what already is available or build new, Elmhurst Cool Cities Coalition appreciates the opportunity to assist in educating the board and the community on the benefits of green facilities and urges District 205 to place a high priority on incorporating sustainability early in the planning process. Additionally, we would appreciate the opportunity to participate in a community advisory committee, and we'd love for the district to participate regularly with our coalition. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Kristen Whitehurst.
I thought this was going to be after the presentations or after the discussion. I don't really have any prepared comments, but I want to talk about some things that have been percolating in my head and certainly have been percolating within the community. We started Focus 205 2.5 years ago. And for a lot of those conversations, a lot of the community kept raising the question of, you're asking us to make decisions and rank things, and you're not giving us context. You're not giving us costs. You're not telling us what we would give up to do this. And at the time we were told, don't worry about it. Just do what you think, rank it, it's no big deal. And the community trusted that that is how that information would be taken forward. Now though, what we keep hearing is, well, this is what the community said, this is what the community wanted. And there's no asterisk that said, oh, but when they made those decisions or when they ranked these things, they were doing so without context, without cost, without knowing what we were giving up, without really getting two sides of the story. A lot of people feel like Focus 205 was very agenda-driven, and I think we're seeing that. It's what we suspected, what we feared, and what's happening. When we hear all-day kindergarten was the #1 thing that came out of that particular, that's because that's the only thing people understood. Michelle Fitzgerald was getting up there saying, you could do this, blah, 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 you could do this, blah, blah, blah. These were concepts no one knew anything about, no one had ever heard of. And so then when it was, well, what do you think? All-day kindergarten, I know what that is. Okay, I'll say that. That's not the impression that the community is now getting. The impression that the community is now getting is, this is what the community said. Even Thought Exchange, I don't have it in front of me, But I'm pretty sure that if you look at Thought Exchange and you look at what people said was important to them, all-day kindergarten is not number 2. All-day kindergarten is number 2 with the number of stars, which means that the people who really, really want all-day kindergarten because they have a 3 and a 4-year-old and they think it's going to happen in their lifetime, they gave all their stars to all-day kindergarten. But that doesn't mean that that was what the community ranked as number 2 in tell us what's important to you. I really think, and this is not going to be popular in this room, I really think that a lot of this is very disingenuous. I think it is incredibly misleading, the information that's being shared out to the community now. I think it borders on deceitful. And I think, board, I'm hoping that you all will look very carefully at the communications that are being sent out to the community now, either one-on-one, coffees, PTA meetings, whatever, what's going out into the Daily Herald, what's going out via the Tribune and the Suburban Life, because they are getting one side of the story. They are hearing the presentations, they are getting the press releases, and I'm very, very concerned that we are being led to an already determined agenda that 2.5, 3 years ago was already predetermined. And that since the beginning, when we were asked as a community to provide our feedback, that feedback has been skewed. The surveys that have been sent out from everything from middle school task force, to, have been very misleading, have been incredibly poorly written to arrive at an already predetermined agenda. And I think that that's unconscionable. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we don't have any other public comments on the list. Are there any others? We'll move on to facilities discussion.
Shannon,
Yes.
our published agenda shows, as Kristen pointed out, that we were going to have public comment afterward. So we've kind of shifted that around. Does that mean we're not going to have any public?
And at the end, I just wanted to give people a chance so
Okay.
they didn't,
All right.
if they
Just
were
wanted to-
tight on time. I'm not sure how long this meeting will last.
Okay, all right, that's a good
So
thing.
with the unknown of the timing.
Okay,
I can
great.
ask at the end too.
Yeah, great,
Okay.
thank you.
Well, I would, at the last meeting, I think that we got further along in terms of concepts and thoughts and ideas, but it was primarily presentational at a board meeting, and I think that my understanding is that the board wanted the opportunity to discuss those things as a group in greater detail, and so this is the opportunity to do that. Our communications consultants are not able to be here. We did put some information in the board packet about the community advisory team and future community engagement efforts, but they will be here on Tuesday night to present in person. I just wanted to make sure you knew that, depending on how much time you had to look at the agenda for Tuesday, that I just wanted to make sure you were aware that was going to happen. So. Yeah, I just referenced this briefly. I just set out at your table kind of a potential topical outline. We don't have to follow that. It just seemed to me that those were some of the big ideas that people might want to delve more deeply into. I thought it might keep people a little bit focused with their thoughts or questions, but it's not meant to be some type of hard agenda that has to be followed. It just was, some of the big ideas that I thought might be pertinent to the discussion.
Question was, were these topics based on the questions submitted? board members?
Not necessarily. I had several board members submit questions in advance when I asked, you know, if you wanted our people to have an opportunity to think about prior to the meeting some of the things that were on your mind, and several of you did that, so I forwarded them so that they could be prepared to answer questions. That kind of came out of our conference call on Wednesday when we were thinking about the latest board meeting and what we thought we heard people wanting to get into more deeply. So again, it's just a reference point. It's not, I'm sure people have questions, and it doesn't have to necessarily follow those 5 items. It just was, I guess, a way to maybe help provide some focus. But I guess what I tried to do was synthesize your questions that you submitted in advance, just create a synopsis of what came to me with some thoughts that you could refer to. But again, I expect with the other document that I supplied for you that you would want to delve more deeply into some of those. I just, that was kind of high-level stuff, just so that you'd have something to walk away with as kind of a reference, or that you could go back to after the meeting, I guess, so to speak, or make notes about, or whatever. The second document is what came from the board members who chose to submit questions ahead of time.
So I kind of want to frame the conversation. We had Focus 205 phase 1, and now we need to go back to the community and say, is this what you were thinking? Are these the ideas you had? Are you interested in these kinds of concepts? So it's really a checkpoint of, did we get this right, or is there something else that the community is looking for? So in order to do that, we need to have the board, as I said at the last meeting, feel comfortable with what we're showing to the community and to get their feedback. Like, we need feedback to see if we're on the right path, if we've missed something, determine what people are interested in, showing the costs and the estimates and the more data now. Did you want to add something?
No.
Oh, okay. So I hope at this meeting we can tell the administration to go forward and ask and start the community engagement process, phase 2, so we can ask the community what they think about these plans. Did you have something? Oh. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so part of my questions last week was to give us some additional information about the community advisory team, and I know you've put out a document that I believe is on for public. It's on public as well as. Yes. Okay, can we pull that up just for a second, Dave? And the reason I'm asking to pull this up, and the reason I wanted to see this, is we need to, the model that we have for the community advisory team needs to make sure we're getting two-way communication. Yeah. And my challenge is that the way I am understanding this document, I do not see the opportunity for two-way communication. I'm sorry. Yes, I can. Facility, if you go to facilities discussion, and then the community engagement plan. Okay. And then specifically, if you will go to community, scroll down on community advisory team, yes, if we can stop right there. So the model how I understand this model that is being proposed for this community advisory team is that the advisory team will review a preset presentation, and they will make comments on the preset presentation. That, to me, is a little bit of, it is a modified one-way communication path. So it's similar to if I could do an analogy, is similar to playing 20 questions, where you answer yes or no, but you don't get to get additional feedback or provide it. So I was hoping that this community advisory model would be structured a little different, in that it would allow the group to provide information and allow the group to provide presentation and information on how they see things and where they want to move forward, instead of having ideas presented and responding in a yes or no manner.
Okay. Yeah, I would suggest that that's not the intent. And that's why I think that the presentation on Tuesday will be important, because I think that they will be able to make that more clear in their PowerPoint, and when they have their ability to share more specific details of exactly what each of these different things would look like. But the whole intent of community engagement that they intend to explain is the idea that it is supposed to be two-way. So you want to have enough time to share information, get feedback on it, and then be able to act on the feedback and continue to refine over time. So, so the community advisory team would help us vet messaging, help us get a pulse on what information the community might like to see and things like that. But the actual engagement process, when we get to the focus groups and other things that go out to the community, is the entire purpose of it is to get that dialogue and exchange of ideas, so that we can get a read on what the community thinks. So that if there is an area a little bit further down in the document, Dave, if you scroll, it is qualitative methods and quantitative methods for gathering feedback. So we would go to different groups in the community. We would have focus groups. We would go to schools. We would go to community organizations, and all of these things would be designed to get feedback and be able to revise our thinking based on the feedback. And so I think it's intended to be a lot more like what you're suggesting than maybe you pulled out of this particular document, but I think you'll see that on Tuesday when they present.
Okay, so
could I just raise a point of order here? Our agenda is a discussion, and I notice we have the same agenda item on 2 separate days. And we have different materials on the same. We have the PowerPoint for Tuesday plus this facilities plan. And I just want to, maybe we can just get a point of order here. Should we deal with the what of this master facilities plan that we are taking out to the community for input at one point, and then do the how as a separate topic? Considering we don't have Malia here, maybe how should be better done on Tuesday night when we have the full presentation, and rather than parsing it into 2 days. I don't want to cut Margaret off. You are raising some very important points and everything. I'm just concerned that we're a little disordered in that we don't have Malia here. We've got other materials. I'll be honest with you, I prepared for today. I saw that on there. Then I see on Tuesday there's a PowerPoint. So I have not been through the PowerPoint. I don't know what the PowerPoint's going to say, and I think our discussion might be a little bit more full and fruitful on Tuesday. I'm just suggesting that, but I'm Margaret, if you want to keep on the process, that's fine. I just think that what we stopped the 13th, what we stopped doing was the substance. We stopped without board questions. That seemed to be the natural next step that we were heading towards then. I'm fine with changing that, but I've talked enough here.
Yeah, and John, and I appreciate that comment, and I realize that we are going to get more information on Tuesday, and we need to understand the what. At the same time, that is the genesis of my question. Is the what that we're going to give to the community advisory team, is the what the facility master's plan? Is that the what the community advisory team is doing?
No, I think that we would share all the work that has been done, and we would talk to them about the types of feedback we need to get to the next steps. They would understand how we got to this point. The facilities master plan, and Brad might want to address this, but this isn't meant to be like the final plan. This is the initial starting point to get the conversation going. That is intended to reflect some of the ideas that we think we heard. And so the community advisory team would serve an advisory role. I think the first step would be we would bring them up to speed and make sure they understand what's going on. We would explain what the community engagement process looks like, and then they would help us structure these things in ways that would be most meaningful for the community. But that group is not necessarily the group that's going to determine the ultimate plan. It's the group that's going to help us get the information to the community and have a productive process to get to the actual plan.
So, and I'm stressing this because one of the things that I continually hear the board, the administration being hit on is communication, okay? So with that in mind, going to the what, without a clear of how this process is going to work, and making sure I understand clearly what the communication process will be, to me, I cannot go to what, I cannot move forward and say yes, because I don't understand what the communication process will be and what we're going to ask the team to do. So that's where I am right now in this process. We certainly can move and go to what and have that discussion, but I just wanted to be sure everyone was aware, without the how we're going to do it and what we're going to be communicating to the community, how they're going to get feedback, and all those other pieces, I can't move forward.
Our hope was that by the end of Tuesday night, we would have the blessing of the board to commence a community advisory team and the next part of the community engagement process. And we might have been able to get further along today if our consultants were available to be here today, but they're not. So we had to schedule that for Tuesday, and on Tuesday, I believe that they will be able to give you the specifics and the details that you're asking for about what the actual community advisory team will be doing and how that process will look. So I think you will feel a lot more comfortable on Tuesday.
So what are we making any decisions today?
I don't think that I hadn't envisioned any final decisions today, but I didn't know exactly how today was going to go either. But I was hoping that by Tuesday, we would be able to have people comfortable that we can, begin a process to go out to the community and see what they think.
I mean, to this conversation, if you look at one of these handouts that Dave put on our chair, the first one was my question to him. It constantly is what is the plan? How does it fit into what we're asking the community for? Do we have enough of something to give to them to at least share what they've provided to us at first? And this really, Focus 205 started way back before Focus 205 started, because we were getting from the community, we want to move the district forward. We got it from the employees, we want to move the district forward. We also heard that our facilities need a lot of money, and we didn't have it. Because we only get facility money, besides maintenance, for 188-year-old buildings, et cetera, is through referendum, and the last time we had one was 2006. Granted, not my intent to go that way, but if the community is saying they want these things, then it's our responsibility to provide them with the information. They don't do it, we do. So it really got started way back, 6 years ago? Almost 8 years ago, with many different, superintendents, whatever, administrative staff. And so with that said, that's what my question is how do you get, and I remember when that last referendum was done, and it took years the same way. It was when everybody was meeting at Madison Building, when the board meetings were there, and I was walking from my home over there. And it was done very similar, and it was the same struggles of how do you get a, multi, 10,000 communities' ideas about what they want for their education system. From parents, from non-parents, 75% now, I think, of our community doesn't have students in the district. And what's their voice? And so for me, my question's always that one. Longer term, this is all about the community. That's what all of us represent. Volunteers as well as employed people in our education system. But then we have to work with them to give them something that they need. You have to have a forum to get ideas. My question is always, just like Kristen's, does the full community really want all-day kindergarten? And so for, the very first item that, Dave said is, really, does the community support that? And that's really the question. So we have to continually ask that so people that don't support it have a voice to say they don't support it. And that's why we've done many different forums to get that voice out there. And so we need to have the data, the facts, support that, okay? If they don't. And, we've looked at doing it from experts in the fields that have legitimate data, numbers coming back to us. And we have to do it that way, not, just voices. We have to do it in a systematic way. And that's what this district is doing on behalf of the community. So the intent of the next step in my mind is, and we've always said this, is to get all of the information so that the community has the entire package. Now, the key question that I always have is where, to your point, Margaret, my comment in the communications plan is, where's that open-ended opportunity for the community to say, not these things, but something else? And you know what I mean? Then we, all along the process, you're always filtering, not filtering, because that's a bad connotation, but it's synthesizing. It's taking in all the data that you get and looking at, what is it telling us? What part of the, what I mean? Is it the majority? Is it what the full community would support? Because that's what our objective is. So I hope that helps. It helps for me because this is managing the short term and managing the long term. And that's really the sweet spot that we are responsible for as leaders.
I appreciate everything you're saying, and it's really about process. And the other document that we have posted today is kind of an outline of a development process. And it's got 4 basic steps, and some of this I've nantered on about before, but then at the end of it is next steps, gathering and sharing information. Is it your opinion, Dave, that we're already through step D in the master facility planning process overview? Just my view is A is programmatic needs, and Focus 205 was extraordinary for that. We found out what the vision of education should be and what the community's response should be. The next thing is kind of a professional endeavor, like you're saying, Karen. We get the professionals in there and we determine, well, where are our current needs, or where are our current facilities wanting, needed, have goals, deficient, and some of these things, these 5 things belong here, and some of them belong further down in the process. Then we review them as a district-wide solutions, and we insert some cost in there. And I think that's when we go back and have the community, because now they're getting that sort of, well, I want it, but it costs how much? And so there, it seems like in step C, there's room for community involvement. And then definitely, well, maybe to a lesser or greater extent in D, but definitely in C. So I'm just trying to take this process, and maybe we can beef it up a little bit in terms of saying what happens and who's involved in the different steps, and that might answer a lot of these questions. And then when we have it inserted, then when we get to our communications discussion on Tuesday, we'll have a little bit better understanding of what we expect the community engagement to do and when we expect it to do it. That's kind of my view of the... Having said all that, what do we do today? We had a presentation on Tuesday. It ended before we got to ask questions. It seems to me natural that we go there, but then we should also talk about this development of the master facility plan process. Then we should talk about the role so I'm not sure what Tuesdays kind of went from A to B to D. The 27th started to go to D, but we didn't have enough time to get to D. So I think this is a good thing. I'm glad you put this out there, Dave. I think it's a real good guided roadmap, but I think it needs to be enhanced a little bit. And I'd suggest we focus a little bit on the process. I don't know, do we continue Tuesday, which seemed to be a substantive review? How does Tuesday fit into A, B, C, and D? Is it D? Are we already at D?
Well, I don't know exactly what more information you need or would like clarified. So I guess I thought that some of that would happen today. Internally, we've done about as much work as we can do at this point, short of asking the community to weigh in. And essentially, the ultimate master facilities plan, we talked about aging facilities, safety and security, all-day kindergarten, future-ready learning, those different types of things that technology, infrastructure, et cetera. And really, when we get input and feedback from the community, we're going to find out a couple of different things. Which of these ideas are most important and how much they're willing to bear and support. And so any combination of these different types of ideas that we showed, if it doesn't resonate with the community and it needs to be pared back or it needs to be eliminated from the project, we ultimately get to the ability to prioritize what the community feels is important in combination with what they're willing to support financially. And that's kind of where we need to get to ultimately bring back to you and say, this is what the community told us it would like to see. I don't know how much preliminary planning there really is that we can do until we find out what the community thinks of where we're at right now.
Well, where are we? Are we on D?
Well, I would say we are. This was meant to be, and actually it was in response to a discussion that we had, a summary of the process so far. And this is what we've done. So we've essentially done everything up to D, and then next steps kicks in to next steps. And so providing more information around any of these points, we're certainly happy and willing to do that, and I expected that we would be doing some of that today. But everything through D is work that's already been done in one way or another.
So we left, did you have something? Okay, we left off at the last board meeting. We didn't ask questions about the presentation. And I wanted to get comments on the presentation. Jim? Yeah.
We have all these questions about
Yeah.
where are we,
Yeah.
where we go, and what the process is. I was hoping to get out of today just to understand
Yes.
thoroughly what is being proposed
Right.
in what's been presented so far. I don't see how we move ahead without a thorough understanding of what is currently being proposed. Just a suggestion.
Do you have questions and clarifications on what was proposed?
I do.
Okay, do you want to kick it off?
Love to.
Okay,
Thank
go.
you. All right. So what I can, I'd love to start with kind of an overview. It looks like we're increasing the capacity of some schools. We're rebuilding Lincoln, which definitely needs to be done. But along the way, to balance the enrollment at each school, we're going to move some boundary lines. Is that correct?
If we're going to get to all-day kindergarten, in order to have some additional space in a neighborhood school concept, we felt that Edison was centrally located. It was one of the schools that was not landlocked, and it seemed to be based on where some natural boundaries could potentially be and where certain pressure points on enrollment currently are a potential solution. We are in the process of a boundaries study. We started we had a speaker call. The initial map has been developed with all of the families in the district that send students to our schools, and we are looking at confirming capacity and space in our buildings as it relates to our current programming. And we had put in one of our presentations that Fisher and Jackson are full. Jefferson is, we're moving, now that we're one-to-one, we're moving away from computer labs. So Jefferson will free up a space. Hawthorne has the ability for 2 classrooms, and Emerson has the ability for 2 classrooms. And so as we're projecting the total number of classrooms that we would need for all-day kindergarten, and where there is space, we came up with a draft idea to expand Edison and make some minor boundary adjustments in certain areas to accommodate space at all of our schools to have all-day kindergarten. And then the result of that would also be a better ability to balance class sizes across the district. Another benefit, the reason why Edison is proposed to be a little bit bigger than you would think it would be is because the other schools already accommodate all of their upper grade levels. So we only need space in the other existing schools for the additional kindergarten space, because as they go up the ladder, that space is already there. But if we move students to Edison, they not only would go there to kindergarten, but then they would move up the ladder in different grade levels, and we would need to have enough space as we completely fill up that building. But exactly how much space is what we'll find out at the conclusion of the boundary study. So if we take a look at that and we have more scientific information, we may find out we don't need quite as many classrooms at Edison, and then we could alter the scope of that project accordingly. But that's kind of why we looked at expanding Edison.
Okay, that's a fair explanation. When will we know when will the boundary study be complete?
So what we're doing right now is maintenance is going with our principals, each of the buildings, and confirming capacity. And we had a spreadsheet that maintenance provided to our boundaries consultant, but there were some things in there when he started plugging capacity and space into where our families were and started to come up with some initial numbers. I wasn't comfortable with it for a couple different reasons. I don't think it took into account where we have programming for children with special needs, and it didn't take into account some of our current programming with things related to instructional coaches and other things like that. And so I'll give you one example or 2 examples that just by way of wanting to have more precise numbers because I'm not comfortable with where we're at. It indicated that we could put 720 students at Hawthorne. We can't put 720 students at Hawthorne. We don't have enough classroom spaces for it, number one, and we could never accommodate pickup and drop off and parking and all that kind of stuff, so that would be ridiculous. It said that Jackson was at 86% capacity, and there is no more space at Jackson, so that was wrong. So we're going back and we're going to get more finite numbers that aren't just, you take a certain number of rooms and you come up with a divisor, because there were just too many inaccuracies in that. But when will that be done? As soon as maintenance can confirm the spaces, he can rerun his programming, and then we can have some different options of some possible boundary areas and some possible movement areas. And to me, I think that would be a good role for the Citizens Advisory Team and future community engagement processes is to have people weigh in on the various different options to balance enrollment across the district and get the all-day kindergarten programming in. So I personally think we could have that within a couple weeks. We certainly want to present it to the board before the end of the spring. And I can't pick a board meeting yet, but we would certainly want to have it to you. I would love to have it to you in April.
Okay, so Karen, if you want to follow up with that, and then, yeah.
Okay,
go ahead.
I'm thinking that this is a parallel. So one thing that I think is a next step to get community feedback is to, I'm going to call it splice the subtle priorities. Because we hear a want for all-day kindergarten, we hear a want about class size, we hear a want about neighborhood schools. So I looked at it as everybody, let's see, there's two options in my mind, might be more, but this is how I was looking at it so far, is every building would need funding, and you've heard this from me already, but still I'm going to communicate it. Everybody needs funding. Every building will need funding if the ultimate priority is neighborhood schools, because we can't do all-day kindergarten in all those places. We can't do class size based on our landlocked Elmhurst. Second option would be some school or schools that have a doable property footprint for expansion, because a lot of our school properties do not, would need funding if we wanted neighborhood schools and we don't want boundary changes. So you have to look at, what do you want and what are you willing to give on neighborhood schools, boundary changes, it's not our decision. Once again, it's a community. And this is the subtlety and the next step that I think we need to get clear questioning out to the community to get the real good, solid next step feedback. And that's why I think where we are is important, and we need to look at what we have from those standpoints. What are competing priorities, and how do we get those questions out to the community to identify what are they willing to give on for what they really, truly, what's most important. Those are the sorts of things. So anyway, your topic, Jim, was on target for a question that I have and a concern, but the way that we frame it. I mean, not frame it, but get information out to the community to really solidify priorities.
Yeah, I'm just thinking if we can fully understand the plan, then we can figure out a way to communicate it to the community so the community fully understands the plan, so that the community can give us some guidance whether that plan is on track with their desires and how much they want to open their wallet.
I like the way you said that.
Yeah.
No, I do, because when you say, well, what are we trying to accomplish, that's it. In my estimation, that's a very succinct summary of what we're trying to do.
Oh, yes.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. Could we go just building by building? Would that be a good way to structure it so that we understand what happens under this proposal, what happens at each building, and what proposed capacities are? Now, I do have a question for our friends at White and Company. Just one quick question. You may want to go, you may or may not be able to answer it off the top of your head. But several years ago, when Frank Hsu came up and said, look, here's our 10-year plan at Lincoln, we're going to invest $10 million in a 100-year-old school, the question was, how much would it cost to rip down that 100-year-old school and build a new one? And I think Frank consulted with White, and the answer came back $20 million, and now the answer's coming back $32.5 million. I'm just curious what happened in that 50%.
At that time, the conversations come up several times over the years, so I'm not sure which time this was, but typically Frank, I believe, would consult with us. He did several times. We would also bring McHugh, the construction manager at the time, into the conversation because we were talking about costs. And we would talk about the desired capacity for the replacement school. We'd look at several options and would come up with some order of magnitude cost based on some of those really broad parameters. So my memory was that there was at one point like a $23 million replacement
You
cost.
know, my fellow board members here are correcting my memory, and they're saying that we did have like a 23, 24, 25
But you may
kinda
be
estimate.
remembering an earlier attempt at budgeting it out. There were several. So, there was at one time this $23 million number. It was several years ago, and it was based on those really broad parameters. So different things have changed over time. Certainly, escalation costs have gone up. The requirements for building a replacement building have brought new code requirements into place. So there could be any number of things that affected that cost. It was a really broad cost, so it was an early planning cost.
And you think this is a much more accurate estimate?
I would think so, yes.
Yes, I do. So we're a construction management firm. We've built new schools in the last 5 years. We built 3 new schools. So we have pretty good data on recent bids, and we use those bids to build a cost model for future work. So I'm pretty confident in the numbers that we've put together based on the square footages that were given to us by White. And I think Lincoln was proposed as like a 79,000 square foot facility. And using recent bids from the last 5 years and then escalating those costs to the near future, we believe it's somewhere in that $32 million range to build a brand new K-5 school with site development. And as Terry mentioned, you know, schools today are a little different. They require a storm shelter. They require detention. The energy codes have changed on mechanical systems. It's driven the costs up in mechanical, fresh air intake into buildings. So things today that are priced are very different than they were, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And the cost of construction has really increased as well due to the market, and the demand for new work has risen recently. So we're pretty confident. I mean, we're pretty confident, and I've got some detailed backup I could share with you to show you how we got to that number as well. So.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that. So let me ask. I'd love to go through school by school, but one question I have that's common to all these schools is it looks like we're spending $2 to $2.5 million roughly per school in what I'll call future ready space. I don't remember what your term was for it. You know, media centers, maker spaces, STEM, et cetera. I'd love to get a better understanding of what goes into that $2.5 million per school.
Okay, and I will turn it over to them. They have some visuals that they can show you, but generally speaking, since each school is different and each grade level is different, there's not one standard answer, but I will give you a better idea. I think I know what you're asking. We have, for example, at Field, the libraries in the basement. The library at Lincoln just flooded this past week. That's also on the lower level. Many of our libraries are smaller. The library at Churchville is not very functional. And they're built to hold stacks of books, basically, and for kids to go in and check out books and, you know, stuff like that. Modern media centers are constructed differently to have the technology infrastructure and to be like research hubs of the school for these interdisciplinary types of things like you saw with Design STEM, for example, the other night, or things like that. And so a lot of it would be redesigning existing spaces. It could be taking out some walls to open some things up, to bleed out into hallways. There would be furniture and fixtures types of amenities that would look different than what our current libraries are. There, in some cases, and this would be more at the middle schools, you would want to have more of the things that support Project Lead the Way courses and other types of adjustments to the industrial tech areas and the computer lab areas, in addition to the libraries. And so one example would be at Churchville, there's a brick wall between the CAD lab and the tech lab. And ideally, what you would want to do is kind of make that a half wall so that there would be the ability with a window probably, for the ability for the supervisor to supervise both stations simultaneously so kids can be going back and forth between design and production and things like that. So each school has different needs, but those are the general types of things we would be looking to accomplish with future-ready spaces. And so would you want to get in a little better detail?
All good questions. I think the best way to answer these is maybe three different areas. I want to give an overview, just as a refresher of how the draft facility master plan, what the different components are. We'll zero in on what future ready looks like. We have some examples that we have prepared to show you when we talk about a 21st century media center. What does that look like? What does a STEM lab or a makerspace look like? These are just examples of projects we've done to kind of give you a visual of what it could be. We haven't done design for all of the buildings yet. And then third, we can talk building by building about what's included in each one. Does that sound like I'm incorporating all the three questions? Okay, so first, let's do an overview of the ingredients. A lot of feedback and positive thoughts on our paint buckets because it helps kind of articulate how we organized the scope of work that's based on all the different feedback. So the building maintenance bucket is incorporating all of those, what we would call deferred maintenance, things that have to get fixed, things that are approaching the end of their life expectancy, that are just kind of capital repairs type scope of work. So building envelope, roofing repairs, mechanical, electrical, plumbing system, either replacements or upgrades, et cetera. The second bucket is the building specific issues. All the buildings have individual building needs. Churchville has a need for an auditorium to create equity with the other two middle schools. Secure entrances, some schools have secure entrance needs. Craig can talk about that as we go through building by building. Some schools have air conditioning. York has some very specific issues. Future ready driven is the components we just talked about. How do we incorporate the right kind of learning environment in the individual spaces to support the kinds of activities and research and collaboration that has to happen in a school for the future, as well as the technology improvements, infrastructure. And then the third bucket, or the fourth bucket, the blue, are those schools that have such significant needs that they just become a comprehensive single improvement. Those would be, as we've talked about, Lincoln School. And we did break out what Lincolnwood School would be if we didn't decide to build a new building. We just wanted to fix it as best as we could. And Field School is a comprehensive improvement, and then Edison School would be that third building. So that last bucket basically incorporates all three of the first buckets for just those 3 schools. And we've split the numbers out in many different scenarios, by school, by elementary levels, by middle school levels, all kinds of different kind of scenarios across the board. So that's kind of an overview of what this draft facility master plan and how it's organized, and all that is based on the feedback from Focus 205, based on the feedback from the educational alignment study that we did, kind of in looking at the buildings, based on the conversations with the maintenance staff and the principals about what the specific building needs are. There's a lot of feedback that have gone into the development of those plans. So now we'll go to the third bucket, the future ready, to give you some examples of what that looks like. And we need to go to the other presentation that Craig downloaded this morning.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, these are just like images of what could be. So this is all just work we've done to show you kind of what could be in terms of these different types of spaces.
So, sort of like Brad refreshing you with the buckets and what each one of those meant. Some of these images actually we've shown you in prior presentations. Some of them were sketches at the time that we actually were presenting to you. They are now up online and being used by the school districts and the kids that we've designed them for. I don't know that I could say it any better than Dr. Moyer said when you described and you defined what Modern Media Center is and what goes into making that sort of a future-ready environment. It's really taking very traditional libraries that were warehouses for books and making them responsive and supportive to the active learning styles from a research standpoint for what your kids are doing in the schools on a daily basis. I mean, that's kind of the long and the short of it. And we accomplish that by a robust technology network, which you have a very good leg up on right now, as well as flexible, agile furniture, so that they can be rearranged depending on what's going on in the course of the day, both for the kids as well as the teachers, right? So the libraries aren't just for the kids anymore, they're for the teachers as well. They do spill out into the corridors in some cases, like this example over at Sunset Ridge. It becomes part of the hallway, part of the corridor. You're knocking down the walls. You're opening up spaces, both horizontally and vertically. And this is a really great example. You know, is there any way we could knock down some of the lights here a little bit? Just, do we have switches are right? Right ahead of them. Yeah, that helps a little bit. So it gives you, at least a look-see at the type of furniture that we would consider and think about. We don't eliminate books. Books are still important, right? But they're not as emphasized as they once were. And so you can see a series of different kinds of furniture that is constantly on the move. There's different places for instruction to happen, whether it's kind of over here in a more larger group setting or in the back with some soft seating, smaller groups. There's some built-in elements and so forth. And then you can see that we're not eliminating traditional desktops and so forth. In some of our libraries that happens, but it happens in conjunction with where there's some resource and some help. So the role of the librarian has changed, right? Matter of fact, kids are even nowadays checking out their own books. And I'm not just talking about 5th graders, 6th graders, 7th graders. My wife's a librarian. She's got her kindergartners checking out books themselves, right? Once they see the older kids doing it, they want to do it themselves. So it's giving kids more choice, more independence, and more responsibility for their educational experience. And the libraries are front and center in that conversation. Here's just a few examples of different kinds of libraries that we've renovated over the years, both from the primary grade level. This is really for grades K, 1, 2, all the way through the junior high school level. Down in this corner over here, you can see it has more of a Panera, Barnes & Noble kind of concept. Study carrels are replaced with booths. And again, it's a place for tutoring, one-on-one activity, places for kids to do small group activities and the like. The opportunities are endless. We have great imaginations. We could do a lot with existing spaces, but we do that in conjunction with talking to your staff, listening to your community, and certainly trying to understand what it is that you want your kids' educational experience to be. So it's a combination of fixed, mobile seating, certainly a refresher of the materials and the finishes, and really a transparency in the space, so it kind of opens up to the rest of the entire school. One more example that we wanted to show you is over in Lake Bluff. This originally started as their gym. It was closed off, converted to a library, and then we started knocking down the walls, providing, as you can see, this sort of the blue element in the back over there. Those are breakout spaces, a place for mobile AV devices and green screens and so forth. And all of the furniture that you see over here, although it does look like it's book intensive, all of those shelving units are on wheels. So they're moved around constantly, right, and rearranged and organized. This actually, again, is the major hub of the school. Kids walk through the library to get from one point of the building to the other. And what they have actually noticed, just recently talking with the librarian over there, more activity in the library. They've actually, the circulation of their resources has, I think, tripled since we've renovated this space. So the content and the resources that are available to the kids are getting out in a more streamlined fashion because it's easier. It's easier to access those things. Yes.
So when you cost out those things on our, in our presentation, does it include all that furniture, or is that just the space itself? Yeah, I'm going to defer to my friend at ICI, Mark Poskin, but really it's an allowance number because as Brad Paulson said, we haven't designed anything yet, but we've talked through the ideas, and based on the database that Mark has available to him and what we know projects cost, we have an allowance number to affect some of those changes. Again, we haven't had the kind of detailed conversations that we have in the design process with you. This is just sort of a initial blush to get us in the range where and give us an opportunity of doing some of these things. Mark, you want to elaborate on that a little bit more?
So just real quick, we had $25.3 million allocated for future ready projects. That's that yellow paint bucket that we had on the screen. So I think there's about $18 million in construction and about $7 million in soft costs. Soft costs make up furniture, technology, infrastructure, design fees, things like that. So there's usually a higher cost of the furniture and technology components of these projects than in other typical construction. So just so you understand. Thank you.
I just wonder, do you, and maybe somebody else will talk about, but when you talk about the tech infrastructure, what is that? What are you talking about doing?
So that is the raceway and the cabling for all of your communications equipment, including computer cabling and touch screens and wireless communication, wireless access points, IT closets, all of that infrastructure that goes in there as well. So that's all inclusive. Yep.
One of the things that we're trying to do over time, irrespective of any major project, is repurpose in our any kind of annual technology upgrades that we do to get away from, and Dave just came back and at a good time, get away from the mounted projectors. And can you explain what we're trying to do by getting away from that?
Yeah, currently in the district, in our classrooms, the display devices are anywhere from, I'd say, 8 to 15 years old. They're analog, they're low resolution, they take VGA connectors, so they're really way, they're dated. they're failing as well, so we have costs for repairs, for replacement, and also the bulbs are expensive to replace. So really the technology doesn't make any sense to continue to try to maintain. And whether or not there's a wholesale like upgrade through through a project like this, or whether we just have to face these upgrades 1 year at a time for 5 years, in phases, one way or another, we have to address this. The ideas that we have are to, and a lot of schools are starting to go this route, is to go with the, the higher definition, flat screen displays, very large. Some of them are interactive, some maybe not, but they're very bright and crisp, and they also have the latest connectors on them. So it's really bringing everything into the current century. The other thing I'll mention is Fisher School does have one classroom. We did have a failed LCD projector in one room. I think it's room 113. We are experimenting with this in that room. So we have an LCD display that's mounted on that moves, so the teacher can move it around and do other work with the wall. So if you want to swing by and see that, the teacher and the kids seem to really love it. So I do think that Elmhurst needs to put a classroom display technology back into the roadmap pretty soon.
Okay. So I asked that question for two reasons. One is I had the opportunity to serve on a committee to raise money to do everything on the very left-hand side of your paint buckets, all that maintenance and stuff that people can't see. And we did manage to raise several $1 million to do that, but it is very difficult to get anybody excited about the idea of replacing wire and plumbing. So I think as we move forward with a communications plan, I think our taxpayers want to know how are our kids going to become better educated if we spend this money. And it sounds like this is what is common to each school. So I think a well-articulated, lots of pictures of what our kids get for their parents and neighbors' tax dollars, we would be well served by being able to show in detail what goes into these media centers and future-ready spaces. Now, the second reason I answer that question is, and my asset liability hat, I want to make sure we match our financing liabilities with the life of our assets. So as we go down the road, as Dave talks about the projectors and we talk about equipment that has a life of 2 to 5 to maybe at the longest 8 years, and then it is obsolete and needs to be replaced. I want to make sure we're not borrowing money for 25 years to finance assets that have a life of 5 years. I want to make sure our financing plan is matched to our asset life plan. Now, these raceways and things that are flexible to run more wire when we need it and things like that, those are 25-year assets. So I have no problem borrowing money for 25 years for that. But personally, the idea of big, open, flexible spaces, I think serves our community well, because as educational trends change, we can, at a very low or no cost, reshape those rooms to match the needs of our teachers and our kids.
So how long would you say you've been doing these kinds of spaces? Meaning, is this like brand new or something that's been going on for a decade? I guess just thinking, sometimes trends come along in education and they come and go sometimes quickly. And so I guess I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, I personally have been doing them for 25 years. So, and it's an evolution. And because education changes, the buildings need to support how education changes. I want to echo exactly what you said just a moment ago. And one of the drivers behind sort of the transparency, openness, the flexibility is because, you don't knock down every single building that you have an issue with and build new. In some cases you have to. Lincoln is the perfect example, but others need to make use of the capital investment that you've made over the course of several years. And respecting the fact that things are going to change and change in ways that we can't even predict right now. How do you do that? You make them open, you make them flexible, and so forth. And these are just some examples of that. I'm not sure I could say it any better than that.
I mean, this is not new. I mean, this is catching up. If you want to look at 1871, or you look at Techstars, you look at the different innovation and incubation spaces, they've been doing this on the peninsula in San Francisco for 15 years.
Yep.
And so, I mean, this very much aligns with the way the kids are going to be working at some point in time in the future.
Or work.
Or currently work, but I'm talking about the fifth graders. But yes, they probably are working like this already. Right. So I mean, I look at this and I see some of the spaces that I've been in on the entrepreneurial and the innovation side of it, and this is very much aligns, and it really is like it's about time, because this is the way the kids are thinking and working, and there's been a lot of study into how you lay out office space years ago, and then the schools are finally catching up.
Yep.
You want to start going school by school then? I think that's the best. Yeah, okay. Brad?
Okay.
Or sorry.
No, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
We're all prepared to do that. That's a lot of schools to go through. I'm not sure if you want to just ask questions and we can respond. Perhaps that would be the best approach. Yeah. Okay. So
before we jump there, you want to show the STEM or makers?
Oh, you want to see some of the makerspace slides that we have to help?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is a view.
Can I just ask a question before we get started in this? Where does all this reside? You're going to be answering questions and walking us through, but where does the public and the board get this detailed information that went into what you're about to tell us? Is it?
We asked Malia to house this, and I'm going to board docs here, the community engagement plan. It's the first attachment for today's meeting. Today's meeting, the 24th. So on the third page of the communication document, we asked Malia, and maybe you can address this. There's a web page, and for Focus 205, and then we also wanted to add these types of documents too that would create the master facility plan. So can you yeah.
Okay.
It's the attachment from today's meeting.
Okay, my link is not opening.
Okay, so the images that I'm showing you, if that's specifically what you're asking about, some of them were presented in the January 27th meeting that we presented, but we've added and supplemented images into this PowerPoint presentation. We'd be happy to certainly give them to the district to post and share with all of you so that you could study them a little bit more robustly.
More than the images, the analysis and line items.
Well, so these initial schematic designs are high level in terms of the fact that we have, I mean, like I've seen a spreadsheet, there are numbers, we can give you numbers, and we can create the site to warehouse this information. I don't know if she's done that or not because my link is not opening right now. But if you the work to create line items for like the FF&E at each building and the very specific stuff that would need to be done, this wall's coming out and whatever, that's all part of a future design phase that hasn't happened yet.
Well, we had slide, and the slides that we went through on the 13th, school by school, and I would ask for some definitions of that. It's really just an extension of that question. Okay. You know, we should have this in a document somewhere. that people who follow up. Okay. All right.
What is it that you exactly want, though? Like, when they say $1.4 million for this at such and such a school, and then they list like air conditioning and something else, you want more specificity to what each of those items at each of those schools entails? I just want to make sure that I know what you're asking.
What's an MEP upgrade and what did it cost? What is an MEP upgrade?
What's
exactly?
Okay, so that's one of our acronyms.
What's an MEP?
And we can get to that, but we have a lot of acronyms, as you pointed out, and my apologies for not being specific about that before, but mechanical, electrical, plumbing items. So it's the nuts and bolts that you were laboring through.
We're not looking at any more detail than that, but just that's the sort of questions I'm asking.
Yep.
And it's in a slide.
And I'll make sure as we go through these
we need to
conversations,
have a little bit more, So if it's going to be on the website, that's great. All right.
Yep. Yeah.
Originally, I was looking for a lot more detail, but you made it clear that the numbers you have are kind of budgetary based upon your experience, and you need to have some conversations with our community in a design phase to figure out exactly how much that costs. In the meantime, I'm trusting you that your estimates are hopefully high. So
they're conservative, right, Mark?
Okay, that's
they are
all
conservative.
good. That's all good.
And actually, it's important to note that I know for sure that Mark has actually kind of extrapolated out construction inflation for the next couple of years, right, Mark? So, anticipating that sometimes things take a while to move through the process and actually get enacted into fruition. So
right, and with any luck, we have a good recession, and we can come in way under budget.
It's coming. It's coming.
Go back to our school by school. I just want to make sure that board members are able to get their questions out. I mean, if I'm going back to the presentation from February 13th, Brad presented, the next slide after that.
Right.
I mean, if there are any questions, like John had a question on maintenance, MEP upgrades, we had that clarified. Are there any clarifications for Emerson? Kara?
Well, it would apply to Emerson and the other schools, but I think in light of what happened a few weeks ago in Florida, safety and security is on everybody's mind. And there are no guarantees, but when you say like security cameras, could you explain what that entails and what that would look like as far as security and safety?
Well, it can mean a number of different things. Certainly you have a secured vestibule at Emerson right now, but enhancing and supporting that would be cameras positioned around the building, inside and out, to allow the monitoring of individuals around the building and certain key points inside the building. Pretty straightforward. Now, at the point that we would look at going into a deeper level of design and trying to kind of brush through all the details, we would have a security consultant with us. We also work in tandem with the local police departments to make sure that everybody is on the same page in terms of what is being proposed and designed, ultimately implemented in your schools.
So you'd look at each school individually?
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
It would it include looking at, like, someone would be able to look at those, like, where would those images go? Like someone in the office at a school, like if you've got the security cameras?
Potentially, for sure.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
The technology for that is you load that up into your system, and depending on how many users you want to designate, when we had those, you'd have the principal's administration, the liaison officer. Different people would just be able to pull that up on their computer. They can watch that stuff in real time.
And just to clarify, do we have any security cameras now?
Yes.
Them in several of our buildings.
Yeah, we actually every building has at least one. I mean, or a few more than one. Every main entrance is under surveillance. And then, of course, York is laced with cameras internally and externally. But every school has some number, and we did it in a priority fashion, working, with the facility, with Frank Shu, and working with the police department also to identify where's the best place to place those for each school, given that we had a limited number. But we do have, as Dr. Moyer mentioned, we do have a system now where we can pull up and look. Each principal can look at it. Also, the police department can, and various administrators, myself, and some other folks can look at those videos and search back up to 30 days. So that's in place, but I would imagine something like this would be an extension of that. It would be enhanced, add more cameras added. That would also require more server space, more things like that. But I think that would either build out our existing system, or we'd have to replace our system to have something that's more, has more capacity.
Okay. So over Fisher. Fisher's next. Yeah.
I had a question for maintenance. What would be helpful is when we show these numbers to the community for maintenance, for example, it would be nice to have a time frame, like how long those pieces would last until you have to put more money in versus when we do a comprehensive solution that can last 50, 75 years. So looking at like the time frame,
we certainly
there's a big difference between the comprehensive solution and maintenance for the time that it's usable.
Sure, and noted. At the point that we start reaching out, we'll have that. We'll be armed with that information.
I mean, just to restate that, we have a 10-year maintenance plan in place. The question is, how much of this money takes money off of that plan? We spend $1.5 million a year just keeping the place running. How much of that will be avoided with this investment today, and then when would it come back online when we spend?
Craig, can we?
And you don't have to answer that now.
I think a good way to approach that would be if you looked at Lincoln and what Lincoln needed just for basic maintenance, for example, that if you built a new school, you take that out, you reallocate that to other existing schools, and you don't have to worry about those maintenance cycles kicking in at Lincoln for another 15 years or so. That's the type of question they're asking, and I think that Lincoln would be a way to give like the easiest example, right? Do you think, or not?
Well, I'm just talking about, just update the 10-year plan. It goes with, you have capital and you have maintenance. And so if you're going to take some of this capital and pay for the maintenance, it's going to take your 10-year needs down. Right. What's that do to our budget? What's it free up from a budget standpoint that can go back into the classroom at that point in time? And I think to Jim's point, how do you sell this on what are the kids going to get out of MEP? They're going to get more money for classroom programs because we're not spending on MEP maintenance and upgrades, and I think that's the context. So you have to do these together. I think you need that 10-year plan and this together.
And it's similar to the question that I have from a bigger picture, short-term versus long-term, and looking at it from multiple perspectives, just as Chris had said. Because right now, what we take out of fund balance to pay for that maintenance right now, right? The last 2 years, correct? Correct. Yeah, so, we're trying to deal with that issue as well. So the question that I would have is to share, it's kind of like how we got to where we are with Lincoln is at what point, I don't know, how do you want to say it? It was York. At some point we had to invest a lot of money. Hawthorne, at some point we had to invest a lot of money. Now we're at Lincoln. Kind of, I would like to see, as a community member, all of our buildings from that short-term, long-term. If we spend this now, not just to the maintenance piece, but at what point, at what point should we be, or do we ever have to look at updating? I shouldn't say it that extreme, wow. But Fisher. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so that's the balancing. I mean, maybe it's a little bit too much to put in this, but those are the things that I think about.
Yeah. I think really that's a very interesting perspective. The majority of your buildings are certainly, if you remember the one slide, the history slide that we presented last time, It kind of showed the majority of your buildings sort of built right around that 1950s, 60s range and so forth, where you had the oldest buildings kind of way at the beginning of the last century. And you know, things have changed so much. We're going through a series of, actually a cycle with a lot of school districts updating those 1950s, 60s, 70s buildings to make them relevant for kids and education right now. And certainly the majority of your buildings fall into that grouping, with the exception of well, two of the three oldest ones. Hawthorne has been already renovated, right? So we could certainly look at that view, but you're sort of a ways away for a bulk of your buildings to be having to look at putting in the kind of investment that we're recommending or proposing for Lincoln.
Okay, and you've looked at all the buildings. I guess the other question is, if I recall correctly, so board, keep me honest here, Fisher and Churchville are part of the city's TIF. How much of this can be used with surplus? And granted, we have to wait till they ever get surplus and all that sort of stuff. But you know, that's all, like a community member, you're kind of looking at all these pieces and how is everybody working together?
I might have to look at Mr. Walton for that bit of advice. It's out of my
to do it today. I don't want to, yeah. I mean, those are just thoughts, so we don't have to address it now, but that's what we should be able to answer at some point.
So I just, you know, as we talk about these, like the maintenance and even building specific issues, you know, we have a lot of facilities with a lot of flooding issues. You know, if you've got a kid that went to Emerson, you know that they sandbag when it rains and the rugs have to be put out and the orchestra room at Churchville floods, and, you know, the list goes on with other, you know, field, the library. And I guess my question is, you know, we talk about $1 million a year in maintenance. That's not obviously enough to pay for those projects because they've been going on for years. So what is the plan, or how would we pay for those projects and address those projects if, I don't know, what is the plan? You guys have all been here longer than me.
Are those included in the building specific?
Is there a way to pay for them?
Yeah, I mean, we've been deferring everything we can defer for, you know, well, at least the last couple of years when the city stopped giving us the money they owed us. But if you look at that list on that 10-year plan, there's a lot of roof tuck pointing, stuff like that. There is not money in that for, it's more like reactive for that. So absent something like this, I don't know that there's, Chris, correct me, but I don't think there's money in the budget for proactive prevention. It's more reactive kind of Band-Aids.
Chris and I talked about this a little bit. He can jump in if I veer too much from reality. But you know, we have to levy by fund, and some of those funds have statutory limits, and 80% of our money's in the ed fund. And so really the only way we can get money for something else is from out of the ed fund. So if we changed our levies around to have to afford some of these types of things, we would be cutting into programs, and I don't think people would like that. If we had to go into fund balance, which we really need to stop doing, but if we had to continue to do that, at some point you might be looking at have to go for an ed rate referendum instead of a facilities referendum, and those are typically harder to pass. So the bottom line is we really don't have a lot of great options at our disposal.
Yeah, I think we've just come upon a topic that is a productive outcome of this discussion. And that question is, should we look at the flooding that we have at these schools and figure out what it would take to prevent that flooding, or at least curtail it, and make that part of what we're asking the community for?
Are any of those items included?
Yeah, so we sat with Mr. Shue and Mr. Morser a couple months ago, and we put together a maintenance list of about $35 million worth of work. And that included some input from the principals at each of the schools as well. So then I went back and I looked at that entire list and I said, okay, of that money, how much of it is actually covered by the improvement projects that we're presenting here? And so the number I come up with is about 14 million of the 35 million is already covered by the projects that you're doing, and that was a question that came up earlier. I think Mr. Bloom was asking that. So that gives you some concept of dollars at least, you know.
We have 14 million scheduled?
It's already,
or in this project?
It's included in these costs.
In these
it's
costs,
just,
okay.
Of the maintenance items, $14 million of that work, or of the 35 is already included in the bigger projects. So that takes your maintenance list down to 21 or $20 million roughly.
I think if I could just add to this, because I might be wrong, but I think I know what you're going to ask. Maybe I'm wrong. The new codes require, with some of this new construction and some of these major renovations, that the stormwater would have to be remediated as part of the project. And so, for example, I told you Lincoln's library flooded, field storage room also flooded. Both of those projects, attention would have to be given to stormwater to prevent that kind of thing from happening in the future, as well as the fact that the designs have included rearranging learning spaces into getting some of those things out of drab basements where there's no light, and putting kids in different places where even if we had some minimal issues with those types of things, it wouldn't drastically affect the learning the way it currently does.
To that point, I would fully support in any kind of a plan that we go to the community for is getting kids out of the basements of our schools, period. It just makes no sense. And if I can bring up two, kind of to the point of Karen's kind of big picture items that I think we just need to be aware of as we go through the process. So we have all these maintenance items, and we do a few every year. I mean, we could choose to do them all at once, but we'd still have a few every year. So Elizabeth, as we plan out our financing for this, I mean, you look at anything if you borrow money for 25 years, half of the money you're going to pay back in total is interest. In other words, it doubles the cost of your project. I would highly encourage us, as we come up with our, if it goes to the point where we're asking the community for a referendum, to come up with a separate channel of borrowing, where for these maintenance projects we can borrow money. So say we spend, our budget is $1.5 million a year. So we borrow $4.5 million in a 3-year bond, spend that money over the 3-year period, and then borrow another 4.5. That way you are not spending much on interest because you're only paying interest for 3 years. Generally the interest rate, as long as we have a normalized curve, and I won't, but the interest rates for 3-year money are generally a lot lower for 10 or 20-year money. And I think we would serve our taxpayers well if we financed our maintenance items that we're spreading out, and we're always going to have maintenance items. So, and Frank Shu's been doing a good job of planning them out for 10 years, and so we see what kind of money we're going to spend where. And if we can level that off at whatever that number is, let's borrow that money 3 years at a time, because if you borrow money for 10 years, it'll add 3/4 of the amount of money you're going to spend, you're going to pay back in interest. So I think that would be a good idea for us to consider when we're at that point. The other thing, Karen brought up, and you guys brought up about the age of our schools. The reason we have a lot of schools that were built in the 1950s is because in 1980, like every other school district, our student population plummeted. Nobody ever thought that those students that were leaving to go off to college and were no longer in elementary and high school would move back to the community, have their own kids, and that leads us to the referendum of 2006. But what we did is we tore down all the turn of the century and the 1920s buildings and kind of gave the land away. So given that we only have a certain debt capacity, that our community only has a certain will to spend money, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we have a bunch of 1950s buildings, and there will be a point in the future, and you're far better equipped than I to tell us when that is, that those buildings will be 75 years old or at the point, whatever point that is, based upon the building, that they will need a significant amount of work. And we need to make sure that we don't straddle our community with so much debt right now that they can't address those facility needs down the road. So I think we'd be well advised to spend a little bit of time with coming up with that estimate of at what point in time roughly will those schools need a bunch of attention. So those are my two big picture.
And just echoing that, I mean, if you're going to spend $1 million, $2 million on some of these schools, know that in 20 years you're going to need to do something so you don't put an addition on the wrong side of the school that has to be torn down. I think just at a very, very macro level, I think the question just is, when we talk about maintenance and building specific stuff, is I think the community is going to expect that all of these issues are dealt with. So very simplistically, we are going to modernize all of our facilities. We're not going to flood the basements. We're going to get kids out of the basements. You're going to have media centers, and they're going to be good for another X number of years. And that's a very simple way of saying what all of this gets you. So we're not, no one's going to come back to you, but in 10, 15, 20 years, we'll have to have another discussion. But this should get you this much runway. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to get at, is if you spend this money, it will get you this much runway. More than, so I don't think we can't get done with this and then have something flood or something where say, oh yeah, you know what, we didn't address that with this referendum, and we're going to have to get more money for it. I think this is the shot where you take care of all of it, and we should be putting the district in a position for the next at least 10 to 15 years to not have any major issues like this beyond just regular maintenance, which may just come out of the operating budget.
I wanted to add one thing. For maintenance, Jim, I agree with what you're saying, but I would argue that 1.5 million is not enough for maintenance. I feel like we're letting maintenance slip through the cracks that needs to be done. So I want a more accurate number of what it really is.
My point was, I was just picking 1.5.
I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I mean, if it's 2 or if it's 2.5, let's just make sure that we have a debt channel that we can finance that maintenance on a short-term, with short-term bonds rather than long-term bonds where we're paying half of the money we borrow in interest. Let's reduce the taxpayer's expense on interest.
Shannon, your point, the rule of thumb in commercial real estate is about $1 a foot, and we got about 1.5 million square feet. The issue that we're having now is because we got really old square feet. Right. And so if we go through this process and have something even remotely close to modern, it should allow us to live within that dollar amount. So that's why we're seeing that we're short, even with 1.5 million right now, is just because we've got really old square feet.
Well, then you make that point, but that's what we want to make sure is validated. I think that's what initiated part of my question. You're the experts to say that.
That's a 10-year.
Although I will, Chris, to your point, half of the square footage in the entire school district is York High School. And the New York is now 18 years old. And, you build a house and 18 years later, you're spending some money on roofs and water heaters and plumbing and things you thought you were good for forever, but you're really not. So let's just keep in mind that York is no longer the New York.
That's what this should address.
I totally agree.
That's exactly the point, actually, is Lincoln, Fisher, some of the major projects and some of the other things that can be encapsulated in this, including some upgrades that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do from an equity standpoint, like air conditioning at the buildings or whatever. But what it does is it knocks that out of the 10-year plan, which is exactly what you're saying, and it removes that for another 15, 20 years from regular maintenance, and it allows us to divert that fund those funds to York and some of the other buildings where they're going to be needed. Without sinking money into a Lincoln, for example, that then, you know, you spend $5, $6, $8 million that you can't spend on anything else. And 10 years later, Lincoln's 110 years old, and you got the same problems.
Speaking of Lincoln, can we move on to Lincoln? You want to talk Lincoln next? Oh, we're not done with Fisher. I'm sorry. Oops.
Okay. So with regards to the red, over at Fisher, it really revolves around looking at the main office, the entry sequence, and all the security issues that we started talking about at the previous school at Emerson. Doing a little bit with staff toilet rooms, which need some renovation, and then the multi-purpose room. Kind of looking at that and updating that one. With regards to Future Ready, and this is going to be consistent in all the buildings that pretty much that we're going to be showing here and going through tonight. The Future Ready, we've highlighted the corridors and the libraries in general as a general rule. And the strategy and the logic behind that is really this idea of efficiency and effectiveness. If you go through your buildings, when we went through the educational alignment study, we noticed time and again, education being pushed out into the hallways, kids taking tests outside on the floor, in a chair or table, desk that was put out there. Trying to find pockets, recreating the hallways so that they're not just passageway to get from one point of the building to the other, but really there are pockets created and opportunities created for some of the spill out activity is what we've been looking at and considering at a lot of schools, and thinking about doing the same thing here for your schools. And again, it's about making your buildings efficient, right? So that spaces are doing double duty. They have multiple functions. The square footage that you have allocated for the kids expands. You don't have to add on space at that point. It's really reconsidering what you have currently.
So Fisher's chock full today. I mean, you can't, it'd be difficult to put one more student in there. You know, in general terms, I mean, how much extra space do you think you can create, or extra usable space you can create out of the existing space that's in the building?
Yeah, that's you know, to get specific, that's hard to answer right now. But there's a lot that we can do by re-looking at the furniture, creating these little breakout areas, and reimagining space like the multi-purpose room and the library. We've done it a lot, and we feel comfortable that we could help things along. Now keep in mind that this is also considering you know, potential boundary adjustments in the district and moving some kids around too. So balancing things out that way. Understood. Yes.
This is great, because what you're talking about is expanding the capacity of these schools by making these hallways usable program space. But are we at odds with the security demand or need that is highlighted in the last 2 weeks that says you got to have enclosed spaces to secure people?
Yeah. Not at all, because we wouldn't be eliminating places for kids to go in case there's a lockdown, and doing anything with regards to any kind of design that would be counterproductive to how your law enforcement officials foresee addressing, God forbid, some kind of event like that at your schools.
That's assuming there's time to get them from an open space to a closed space.
Well, you would have that problem now, or if and when we do something in your buildings.
I'll give you an example, John. In my last district, when we built a new school, if somebody were to somehow or another get through the main office, which was a secure entrance, there was a way to, you hit a button, you close off the academic area so that that person can't get to where the students are. Or you can do Like right now at Lincoln, as an example, the Edison project takes this into account. If you take a look, we've got bathrooms in the classroom, so that, and Lincoln would be able to have the same thing because of its being new. You don't have to line kids up and waste that instructional time a couple times a day walking back and forth. But every time you do that, those kids are out in the hall. You know what I mean? So I mean, I think what Craig is suggesting is that you would just revise kind of your procedures and protocols, and you might plan a little bit differently, but you wouldn't compromise the safety of the kids.
Yeah. Lacing every conversation that we have is the idea of safety and security, not just for the kids, but for the teachers. So.
No, just observing that it's a new design consideration that's far more significant than it was in years past.
So noted. Yep. Yep. Moving over to Hawthorne, you can see the proposed investment there really is minimal, and that's reflective of the fact that you've done a pretty comprehensive improvement project there already. There are a few items on the outside of the building, some tuck pointing that needs to occur. That's just regular maintenance. That kind of stuff happens. But then looking at the future ready elements, again, the idea of a media center, and it's pretty traditional over there. There's some adjustments that we can make to that space to keep in mind where those kinds of spaces are headed, the design of those spaces are headed, and combining that with some maker activity would be really ideal, but very minimal. Anybody have any questions about Hawthorne? Jackson. Over here, some domestic water piping replacement under maintenance. If I'm not mistaken, Terry, does this not, of course, perfect. I believe that Jackson does include some remediation of some stormwater issues that you have over at that site. So we've looked at that. It's figured in. And then building-specific items, air conditioning, of course. And over here, we get into a conversation about your main entrance. It's kind of an awkward sequence of events, how you get into the school, trying to, in this case, it might be some new construction that needs to happen just because of the location of the main office in relation to the vestibule and the rest of the building. We've got that accounted for in the $4.8 million. And then all the same stuff. I don't want to sound like a broken record, though, for future ready, though. The only thing that really changes from school to school probably is the number, and that's reflective of the fact that each one of your buildings has its uniqueness. Okay.
And you just brought up a point that I was just trying to keep track of. There is a variation in the numbers per school, and one of the things that we also need to keep in mind, in the back of our mind, is if there is a significant variation, being able to justify why one school is getting much more than another school, because that's going to need to be a selling point.
And that's very interesting, because if you remember from our last presentation, security and equity across the district was the main drivers underlying everything that we're talking about. It doesn't necessarily always translate into dollars, but it certainly translates into what is ultimately provided and anticipated as far as improvements. So we're going to have to watch that very closely. Moving on to Jefferson. Again, over here, some mechanical, electrical, plumbing upgrades. Roofing replacement is kind of on the docket and some asbestos abatement, certain materials in and around the facility. And included in that is some domestic water piping replacement. So the number's a little higher than some of the other schools that we've looked at to date, but certainly we got some dollars for those items. Building-specific items, site redevelopment over here for sure. We know there's some flooding issues. Air conditioning, and then over here again the main entrance and the main office remodeling, kind of grouping those two things in tandem to maximize security as people are coming into the building. And you can see that number is fairly significant, $5.2 million, because of the items that we're considering, specifically the amount of site development that really needs to happen over here at this school. Then future ready, again, I'm a broken record.
I'm sorry, remind me what site development is again.
Site, improving some of the issues that you have with flooding and on the site, and in and around the site. Madison, the whole building is red. Okay, but you know, it's a building, an elementary school building that you've put your early childhood program in, and just to kind of reiterate, getting that up to a level that is in keeping with a little bit more child-centric nature, responsive to the age of the kids and the different kinds of activities that they do over there. Capitalizing on the fact that hallways are as important of a space as the classrooms, that certainly at this young age, as they're transitioning between rooms, trying to grab their attention, using it for educational purposes like Dr. Moyer was mentioning, that is really at a fever pitch when you're talking about early childhood. And then starting to think about some of these spaces, reimagining those spaces for the program is really important, again, because this was a building that was originally designed for older kids. Yes.
How's our capacity there? Or are we?
I have to go back. I think you're fine as far as capacity. And actually, I would think that with the right kind of renovation, you might even be able to certainly increase the capacity for the program here at the school.
Susan is here, and she's always asking for things for her school. So, but the. We could serve more kids than we currently serve because of the capacity issues and the nature of.
Does she want to come in? Susan, wait. You're coming.
Susan, by the way, that's your job to be asking for stuff for your kids.
It is. See, I'm just doing my job.
See, remember that, Chris. All I was just going to say is for the inside of this building here, it's really not laid out correctly for early childhood students. So in effect, if you did a comprehensive renovation of the space, you could increase capacity. Right now, we are at capacity. We can't fit any more students in the space that we're currently at. We are probably currently right now at about 330 students or 340 students that attend Madison right now. And so it's maxed out. We've kind of used every inch of available space and even kind of subdivided a couple other spaces that were there to create more classroom space. But without doing a major renovation of the space, you cannot fit any more kids in there currently right now. But it could be redesigned because the space is not used as efficiently as it could be. Sorry, that's it.
Should we clarify a little bit
Sure.
there? I mean, you say they're at capacity, we can't have any more students. We don't deny students, right?
What?
I mean, we've got some paid students, or I mean,
we do. Yes,
okay.
that's what I mean. As far as for the students that we have to serve, they're our priority first. So that's always included. But the maximum amount of students that we can currently serve inside that building right now is 340. So what I mean by that is that if we have more, if special education needs increase, then that just denies sometimes as availability for the program for some of the at-risk kids or other kinds of students that are tuition-based that are paying currently. Does that make sense?
It does make sense,
Okay.
but then I guess my next question is at what point do you have to look at expanding even the exterior, you know what I mean? Like, or do we have to think about that?
I don't know, because I think that really there is a lot of wasted space inside the building right now. So if you did a comprehensive renovation of the interior space, I think you could be able to go ahead and be able to accommodate more students inside the building. There's a lot of wasted space right now.
The only reason why we had a big debate about this at the core team level. The only reason why this building didn't fall into the comprehensive category, because I know you're thinking about that, is the fact that it's renovation only, right? It's not adding new square footage. And as you heard, we can.
It's also not. It's also fixing that building in and of itself. It's not connected to in the same way that some of those other projects are interconnected.
Okay. So that's sort of the elementary schools, and these are the totals, if you remember. They've all totaled up between the three different buckets. And then if we move over to your middle schools, Bryan If you remember, that was part of sort of the whole conversation that we had about Lincoln and creating additional space, but right now they are tight for instructional space. So adding new square footage, classrooms down here to kind of round out the sort of the finger concept that you have, and then getting 2 new classrooms over here where your main office is, and relocating the main office to new construction in the front with a security vestibule again is really the big move that happens over here. And then looking at your vocational spaces, your enrichment programs, the media centers in the hallways, and to kind of capitalize on again, what the kids are doing would be just like all the other buildings, part of the conversation and the design approach at this building. Moving over to Churchville, sort of the same kinds of things. Again, there's some maintenance items here, I think a little bit more significant, certainly from a dollar standpoint than Brian. But in this instance, it's not showing up very well over here, but thinking about an auditorium, the far end of the building, the far south end of the building over here that spans multiple levels. And then looking at you know, some of your media centers, your media center and some of your enrichment programs over here as part of the renovation approach is on the docket. And you can see really there's quite a bit of dollars being spent over at Churchville for upgrades and improvements to this building, but the most being certainly the building specific items to get it on par with your other middle schools. Yes?
Churchville is the one you described before as wasn't built as a school originally. It was built as something else.
Churchville?
Yes.
I don't recall that, Terry. That's
or Dave.
I think I think that it was originally conceived of like apartments and stuff, and it became a school before it was part of our district, I think. And I think part of that explains why you have those real narrow stairways where you're only going up and down on different sides and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Just a broader question. It seems like every diagram has the hallways, all the hallways designated as future-ready space. So what are those repeated changes? I mean, away from places where you'd be looking at opening up.
Sure. You know, we have, Dave, could we pull up that other PowerPoint presentation? We have a few slides that would depict some potential solutions. Let's go down, keep going, scrolling down to maybe like the 10th slide or so. Go right, slide 12. Yeah. Here's an existing hallway that was a double-loaded hallway, classrooms on either side, and certainly by just removing some lockers, sticking in a built-in bench, some glass kind of opening up the floor plan, creating pockets for teachers to have one-on-one with kids outside the classroom, maybe in a more private setting, or well, it's a public setting here. If they needed something more private, creating little huddle spaces at the end of the hall. These were just nothing but hallways. Perfect example of what we're thinking about. Now, obviously, it doesn't happen exactly that way in your buildings, but we'll figure that out.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Any other questions on Churchville? I think we also had some site improvements over here, paving replacement, pretty extensive. One of you brought that up, I think, at the last meeting, so that is part of our anticipated improvement plan. Yes?
What's the industrial arts repurposing? Could you just say what that is?
Yeah, and it's part of a bigger conversation about your program, the industrial arts program, and ways that we can kind of reimagine those spaces, whether it's through technology, equipment, or certainly programs. That's a conversation that we've started, but we have a long way to go. I don't know, Dr. Moore, if you want to add anything more to that.
Well, we're trying to turn those types of programs into career pathways, real world types of experiences, the types of things you've heard us all talk about. So it's not like your traditional shop class space. So you incorporate elements of that with certain types of perhaps machines or technology, but it would function differently, and so you would have some alterations to how the space is set up. And I gave the example at Churchville, but each of the schools has a different layout, and their facilities are located in different places. And so one of the things, for example, when you go to Churchville, is, if I recall, it's on a level where you're like, you're going down steps and up steps, and you've just got, you could turn that around into something that's much more functional, I guess is.
Yeah. This is some of the, actually it's interesting to note some of the challenges that they have over at Churchville are maybe on the lighter side, but of what you're experiencing, over the kids experience over at Lincoln, up, down, in, through. I mean, it's, some selective improvements over here could fix that. Yes?
At one point we talked about trying to move students out of the basement. Is that a factor at all in Churchville? Because I know there's a lot that happens in the basement in Churchville.
Yeah, we could take a look at that for sure. At this particular school, it's.
And actually, that was a question. It was whether that was included in that or not. And if it's not, that's okay. I'm just trying to understand what's in there.
It's not at this point.
Okay, thank you.
From a big picture perspective, Churchville and Fisher have been drawn into whatever TIF. I mean, there's so many that I've lost track. TIF 4. Just from a perspective of they're in the TIF. I see no reason why we shouldn't ask the TIF for part of this renovation money. I mean, maybe to make it easy, the auditorium could be a TIF project. Just throwing that.
Yes,
out
I think that. So right now the issue is very complex, as we all know with that. But technically, if you took a look at the way the TIF's written and everything that's in there, we should be able to make application for funds or for projects up to a certain amount, I guess, and some of it's already pulled out as earmarked. The city will say that the TIF isn't performing and isn't scheduled to perform for another couple years. So what we're kind of laying out here is needs. If we're able to pay for some of these things, like you're suggesting, out of the TIF, which we certainly would do, that would lower the amount that we would have to finance, or that we would repurpose to something else that the people might possibly say they want.
And even if you had to finance it now, waiting down the road, 10 years to be reimbursed from the TIF, you could then take that reimbursement money from the TIF and put it in our capital projects budget. Because 10 years from now, we will have more capital projects needs, I'm sure. Maybe John, you're the TIF expert. Maybe you can't do that. I don't know.
I really don't know. I'm not a finance expert by any stretch of the imagination, but by drawing these into the TIF district, those funds can go to school purposes. Yeah. It's something the city of Chicago did in the 1990s to enhance their neighborhood school system.
And that's why we asked to extend originally the TIF did not include those schools, but we asked the city to draw those schools into the TIF boundaries, and they did.
Yeah, it would be hopefully another resource available. That's a timing issue, as you describe. And
Chris, are if we build the city for this now, as your understanding of the existing agreement, if we build the city for some projects that we did now, as long as they were for Churchville and Fisher, would we legally be able to reimburse those costs? Okay, so then, it would just it would have to be for things in the TIF, and so we could possibly pay back that. We could possibly even pay back that debt, couldn't we? There's things we could do. There's things we could do.
I mean, the intergovernmental agreement was structured such that we could spend the money and we could put in for reimbursement. So it would be actually those improvements that would go into the TIF that just we would fund them first, and then when they had surplus, they owed us up to $6 million.
That's correct.
Assuming they live up to their obligation. I'm hoping.
Last on the list then for the middle schools is Sandburg. And really, by comparison to Churchville, maybe a modest amount in terms of building specific and, well, maintenance and building specific items. But because of the size, space and so forth, probably looking at more of an investment in terms of the future ready items that we've been discussing all along. I think, actually, this is a good point for me to interject over here. The security main entrance office renovation, that was a particular item that came up the first time we had a workshop, our very first workshop, Saturday workshop. One of the community members corralled me and was asking questions about that because we didn't mention it at the time. So I'm going to mention it now very specifically, that Sandburg then would be the beneficiary of getting such an improvement. Okay. This is how they total up by category for the middle schools?
One question. Yeah.
Yes.
Will you say that one more time, that, because you emphasized.
Sandburg entrance?
Sandburg gets a security entrance, vestibule, and a main office renovation. That's the short end of it, right?
So in this plan, at the end, the end game of the plan, will we have every school up to date with the security?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Very close between building specific and future ready items as far as dollars go, but pretty significant investment for all three schools. Lastly on the list then is York, and as we kind of veered off, did a little detour on one of the other schools, talked about York. Still there are some improvements that need to be made from a mechanical, electrical standpoint, some roofing replacement, paving, as well as tuck pointing on the outside of the building, just because of the age, right? Building specific items. The auditorium was not part of the original comprehensive improvement that you made to this school, so taking a deeper dive into that space is contemplated, as are reorganizing some of the ball fields that are on the south end of the site. And then lastly, we have $1.1 million allocated for future-ready items, but I believe the district is already in the process of updating those spaces, the STEM space, business incubator. Those will get done in 2018 and 2019, respectively. So it's really, you can knock probably that off the list already. It's being paid, I would imagine, through the maintenance fund.
Yeah, that number's a little high because we're going to do the work internally as opposed to contracting it out. The infrastructure expenses, the anticipated infrastructure expenses for each space, we shared with you as a plan for summer 18 and summer 19, I think, at the October board meeting. So those are currently slated, assuming that well, the summer 18 is probably starting to bid it out already, I assume, but assuming we go according to plan, we would probably be able to knock that off independent of some of the other projects that you see up there. The auditorium, as Craig said, was the referendum for York. That was, people are asking, why would you consider that? That was left out of the last referendum because of cost. So it was originally planned, and then as the project unfolded, they took it off the table. And so that auditorium has not had any attention in a long time. And if we don't find a way to pay for it as part of this conversation, I'm not sure when and how we would ever be able to access the funds to actually accomplish that. And we do have significant, Craig actually sat down and met with the fine arts people over there, and we have really, really old, almost unsafe equipment. When we do productions, I believe that we rent a lot of stuff and bring stuff in. We will be able to explain in greater detail why we're contemplating, as the word that Craig used, this project and the need for it. But I just think it's important to know that it was 18 years ago, it was slated for upgrades and it got pulled out of that project. And so nothing has really been done to the auditorium there for decades, and it's struggling.
Did you consider the issues with the air conditioning and the neighbors and a potential solution with that, where the air conditioning has to shut down and at night?
Speaking of things that was pulled out of the York plan.
I'm going to defer to my colleague on this one. Has a little bit of better history with that than I do.
No, we don't have any kind of adjustments to the cooling towers in this plan. That wasn't considered.
Maybe we should revisit that.
If we could take a look at that. We probably need to talk a little bit more about the goals, but yeah, we could take a look at that.
Okay, thanks. And I will say that the riggings, the lighting in the York Theater were there when I was there. I never, it was that long ago. And frankly, they were old. They were really old then. I never thought my kids would be pulling on the same curtain ropes that I was. But, you know, also, you know, York's 100th anniversary is coming up. And I really think it's an opportunity to raise some private money for that theater and ask the taxpayer for a little less money. You know, as we plan events around York's 100th anniversary, I would highly encourage us to solicit alumni for some donations to that theater. You know, they can go home with the old curtain that, or have a plaque with their name on it on some new lights.
Is there an opportunity to shift some of that to private giving with a view towards solving the air conditioning?
Yeah. I mean, why not, right? I mean, the less we can burden our taxpayer and use that 100th anniversary to raise some private money, why would we not take advantage of that opportunity?
So this is the last school. Oh, the comprehensive improvements. Yeah, well, whoops, okay. Like we did before, you want to take a break or? Okay.
Okay, thanks for your patience. We'll continue with the comprehensive improvements.
Okay, here we go. So we'll start off with Edison. We're on the fourth bucket, the comprehensive improvements, and Dr. Moyer addressed some of the why for Edison at the beginning of this afternoon, or this meeting. But just for reference, what you see in red, if it's dashed in a red line and colored red, that is contemplated as new construction. Sort of the orangey color is areas of renovation, more extensive renovations, and certainly what's in white is kind of left as existing with some minor amount of finished upgrades. But over at Edison, we're looking at roughly about an addition for 11 new classrooms, relocating the library to the center of the facility with a courtyard on either side. And really the big move then is moving the main entrance from where it is, kind of tucked around the corner over here, to the front, what would be the new front of the building along Fair Avenue. So a pretty big adjustment, and then again reflective of balancing enrollment.
Yeah, this design, I just want to point this out because this is kind of reflective of what we're trying to do everywhere, which is kind of making the media center the hub of the building, the life of the building. And so when you walk in the main entrance, you get through the office and it opens up right into the media center. And you'll see in some of the other designs how the media centers are more prominent in the design, and that's kind of, I mean, that's intentional. That's to try to accentuate the, you know, fact that we want those spaces to kind of be the lifeblood of our buildings.
Any questions about Edison?
Well, this is really more for you guys, but so when, and if you said this, I'm sorry, but I'll have you repeat it. When would we know how you're going to really fill those classrooms? Because that is that's a lot of classrooms, and the price tag on this piece is significant, and so, yeah, I'd like to really understand what all those classrooms would be used for and when we would know that.
Well, we could tell you exactly how many we project that we need. You know, there's a balance between spending all kinds of money on a new project within the constructs of what your budget number is, and then finishing the project and finding out that you're out of space. So we're trying to balance, you know, the space needs with the long-term planning needs and things. And right now, I would say Edison probably costs us about $250,000 a year to run in its current configuration because of the inefficiencies in class size across the district and scheduling, the special teachers, the student support services people, having travel teachers, and all of those kinds of things. So if you took a look at the number of students in that building versus what we could do if we had a different type of arrangement, and what we currently do now because of the fact that you have these types of sections where you get 36 second graders and you can't have one section, so now you have two sections of 18, that kind of stuff. Those are the types of things that are leading me to that number. So ultimately, what this would do is, as we reconfigure the boundaries, there would be it would allow for the space for all-day kindergarten. So you would be moving kids over there. But those kids would also matriculate through additional grade levels up the ladder and would need a place to go. So it's not just a one-time thing like it is in these other buildings where you need an extra classroom or two extra classrooms because you're doubling kindergarten sections, but then they go right up to where they would go into first grade anyway. So that's why ultimately when it becomes a 4-section school, that's how many spaces you need to accommodate a 4-section school. If we balance enrollment across the district and go to the number of extra classrooms we need for all-day kindergarten, we think. Now the boundary study, if it turns out that we can cut that back a little bit, you know, we can do that. But this is the projected need right now. The auxiliary effect of being able to do this in this fashion is that it gives us some options for housing kids during the Lincoln construction. And then, so the building would be full during that, and then it would gradually fill up as we open all-day kindergarten in the subsequent years between the addition of kindergarten and the boundary changes. And then, so then that money that you're spending for a permanent solution reduces the cost of what you have to spend on the Lincoln project, and also what you would have to spend on to temporarily house students if you didn't have enough additional space in the building. I think we gave the number at the last meeting that the trailers cost about $250,000 each for however many years you have to rent them. So those are all different things, but all-day kindergarten was really the primary driver of this, and then that in effect then gives us the opportunity to balance class sizes, and as a nice bonus gives us the opportunity to plan for the Lincoln project.
Kind of a follow-on. Could you, I guess it'd be you guys, break down for us like what just the cost of the classrooms would be. I mean, there was a price tag, I believe, of 18 million. Does that sound right? What does just the classrooms cost, or is that a possibility versus the entire plan?
The classroom addition, one story, 17,000 square feet, about 11.6 million. That's new construction. And then the rest of the work is all renovation work, separated by different areas. So I can break that down for you if you'd like. Is that good enough? Okay.
Thank you.
Just, you said 11 million?
11.6.
Thank you.
Anything else? Sure.
Okay. Is it possible to do something like a project like that in 2 phases? Like, can you just like, or does it all have to be done together? Like, can you do just classrooms and then, you know, later on, or is it better, more economical to do everything all at once?
Certainly there's an efficiency of doing everything all at one time, but a lot's going to really depend on the number of students that you have and the kind of spaces that you need to make sure that school is functional for them. So we could take a look at that. You know, right now, if you remember when we put an outline together for construction or implementing the design, doing the construction, it was thought of that we do it in one time.
The oversight, perhaps, the community made in 2006 was we increased the capacity of a lot of our schools, but didn't increase the capacity of the library, which we're taking care of now, or the lunchroom. And I don't see us adding a lot of space to lunchrooms here.
Yeah, the conversation came up. We spoke with the principal, and just through the course of the conversation, you know, and thinking about the potential number of students that we have here, we'll be able to accommodate them in the cafeteria over here. So an addition isn't necessarily warranted for the cafeteria. Yeah, we did consider that.
All right. I mean, I have fewer questions now that I understand the plan is to free up space at many of our elementary schools in order to accommodate the extra classrooms needed for all-day kindergarten, that we're going to move some boundary lines. And we're, you know, because Edison is easier to build onto, we'll build onto Edison and increase its capacity. Because I mean, frankly, to spend $11.6 million on an addition to save $250,000 a year in operational costs, that payback's 46 years. I can't, you know, I can't get behind that, you know, just as a standalone. But as part of a more comprehensive plan that we're actually we're adding on to Edison, and really what we're doing is we're adding classroom space to many other buildings that just are landlocked. That makes much more sense to me. Now, I think clearly if the community needs to accept the boundary changes. And, you know, I think that is the next crucial thing that we need answered is can the community come to terms with that? Is that okay?
And I like the way that you communicated that. It's kind of how we got to this point, why Edison. And so, oh my goodness, I'm going to apologize that I lost my train of thought. Oh, but this is where we need to then look at what I said about the different subtle priorities and the things that the community then has to think about. And we want to present that to them to get their feedback versus assume that they're going to get it. You know what I mean? Because there's a lot of moving pieces with this one about how to look at it, and they'll think about it after. You see what I'm saying? And so what I think that we should be prepared, you know, to say, here are the trade-offs that you might have. An example would be, you know, if you didn't want boundary changes, you know what I mean? This is the alternative, and this is what that would cost. You see, and you know, at some point, we have to be able to answer those questions and have the financial background so that they could weigh the same thing, because I did the same thing, Jim. I'm like, you know, this is the only way that it makes sense or pays off in my mind. But then I go, okay, so am I on board with that? We really, it's not leading the community at all. It's actually helping them get to something that they might, like months down, you know, the road after really kind of thinking about this, because we've been thinking about it for a while, to help represent the community, if you will.
Yeah, Karen, I think you bring up a good point here. I think one of the first questions the community is going to ask to the people that are opposed to any boundary changes is, what does it cost if you don't change any boundaries? And I think we should anticipate that question and be prepared to answer it.
And not just how much does it cost, how likely are you to be in a class of 28 students? And if there is a boundary change, then that is very unlikely versus what we have right now. So it's balancing class sizes also. If you want a smaller class sizes, then some minor boundary adjustments could accomplish that, because we hear that over and over with the class sizes. And I just want to make one more comment too. We also need to communicate like what boundary changes mean. There are a lot of different ways you can go about it. Anyone that's already in the school would not be affected. I mean, there's different ways to do it. Your family would not be affected. Only students that have not entered the school, families that have not entered the school yet. So there's different ways to do it too, and it all would have to be, you know, very well communicated, different options, pros and cons. Did you?
Yeah, I think we need to anticipate as many questions as we can so that we're prepared to answer them. While you were talking, another question I think people will ask is, okay, if you take this and just cut out the pieces that are, or segregate the pieces that are just there to accommodate all-day kindergarten, what does that cost? So that we can put a dollar figure on all-day kindergarten.
I wanted to, I think putting the dollar figure on is a good idea. I also think there's hidden costs to that dollar figure, because people talk about the 75% of the people that don't have kids in school. Those people are going to want to sell their home someday. And 67% of school districts in DuPage County currently have all-day kindergarten, with several adding them, and 7 out of 8 of our of the top performing unit districts that we compare ourselves to have it as well. And if we miss the opportunity to get it with whatever this project ends up, you know, looking like, I'm not sure when that opportunity comes around again. But I would say that I would like to echo a comment that Shannon made. What we're anticipating at this point, because of the way we would have to stage this project, is that we would be able to tell the people by the time all-day kindergarten is able to open up, we would be able to tell people on the front end what the boundary adjustments would be, and we would either, no current elementary students would be affected, or possibly the ones that would be into their upper grade level, to where we could grandfather those families in, with different types of ways that districts do that, with siblings and other things like that. So I think the initial map that Chris and I looked at, the amount of neighborhoods that are potentially affected, I think, combined with the fact that we wouldn't be moving current students around and stuff, I'm hoping that we can be able to explain different options to people that are out there and get them to understand some of these things. And that's what we hope to be able, like I said, to start bringing forward before the end of this school year, hopefully in April.
Looking at boundary changes, it's just the elementary schools. So when you say upper grade level, you're talking about upper grade level upper elementary.
We would when we take a look at those boundaries, we would take a look at then the secondary effect of what does that mean for the middle schools? So we would bring that into the conversation. But Karen made a comment before when she talked about getting the community to understand and getting their reactions, that's exactly why we think it's so important that we are able to get that second part of the process off the ground.
Any other questions on Edison? All right, let's move on to Field, and maybe not necessarily tied directly to sort of the shifting in the implementation for Lincoln, but certainly does fall under that category, more comprehensive improvements with the amount of square footage that we would be adding, getting kids out of the basement, relocating the main entrance, main office on a level that is accessible by visitors and students alike. And then really the big move, taking the library that's in the lower level and then moving it towards the back half of the building on the north side, and then combining that with 4 classrooms for all-day kindergarten. That is probably the bigger chunk of dollars spent as far as Fisher goes for new construction. And then it's just taking a look at some of the basement spaces to repurpose them, perhaps for some professional development. Improvements that we would be doing over here does involve stormwater detention, so providing some measure of relief from the flooding that does happen over there on that side too is part of this improvement project. So I'll go back to the floor plan, the first floor plan over here, and address whatever questions that you might have with regards to this school.
Which parts of Field, your previous slide said 100-plus-year-old school, which parts of Field are 100 years old, and if they're not yet, when will they be?
Yeah, well, there's an addition on back over here, which was a little newer. You notice that we're not touching that. But really, this is all your existing building over here. I want to say that, Terry, you might help me out over here. You got the study, but I think this might be a little earlier or later. I'm not exactly sure the year, but primarily it's really this part of your building that is approaching 100 years old.
The original building was from 1931, and then the majority of the building at the south end was 1950. So not 100, but 60 plus years old.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the 1930s, I mean, this kind of this is in less than 2 decades going to become kind of a Lincoln situation.
Yeah.
Do we really want to add on to a 85-year-old school? Are we going to look like we made a dumb decision 20 years from now?
Yeah. So there are some differences between certainly Lincoln and Fisher. They might share maybe the same vintage. Field, I'm sorry. Yeah, Field, I'm sorry, Field and Lincoln. There are, certainly they're of the same vintage. But the organization over at Field is in far better shape than it is at Lincoln, without question. The challenge that you have is navigating between the levels. We're going to be able to solve that with the addition on the back, certainly, and then by relocating the main entrance, and then making other improvements to the infrastructure for sure. But your point is taken. It's still going to be a 100-plus-year-old building. It's not going to be the new Lincoln or that some of the improvements you're contemplating at the other schools. So it's a question.
What kind of, I mean, once this main part, the oldest part, is 100 years old, mm-hmm. what kind of challenges do we face mm-hmm. Keeping that building intact?
Yeah. That certainly remains to be seen, but if you're constantly be looking at improvements, right? And as buildings get older, they're going to be challenged with those improvements. Having to do more and more. You're seeing it even with York, right? As much money as you put into York and 18 years ago, there are still certain things, whether it's from a mechanical end or tuck pointing for the masonry. You're going to have some of that over here too, that maybe we don't take care of right now, but eventually somewhere down the road, just yearly maintenance, that's going to happen. And it's kind of hard to predict what those items are going to be. But you're still going to be having to make a regular investment into that school as well. There's no question about it.
My lingering gut feeling is that the best decision we could make is to put an addition on such an old structure? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it kind of doesn't gut check well.
Right.
Wasn't there a facade project at Field? Frank's not here, but a dozen years ago or more, when it was like a can of worms. It just kept opening up and opening up. And I'm just wondering if there was things learned during that process that have fueled this investigation and determination about this.
The facade project, I know there was a major tuck pointing and facade project done, but Frank, we weren't involved with that. There was a specialty consultant, I believe, that Frank brought in, a specialty facades consultant that he brought in to work on that.
Frank will remember that. He kept coming back to the board for more money because they kept opening this can of worms at the time. And that's a lesson one way or another. Either we discovered things and remedied them, or in the other direction, we got a view into the abyss, so that Jim's describing. So,
that's a great point you make, and it might go to further investigation of other options for Field over here. But the older that the building is, the more unforeseens that you have when you start opening up walls, making connections, and doing things. And these costs reflect maybe a little bit of higher construction value at the points where we're touching the existing building, between the new and the existing, right? Because of some of those unknowns. As you go down the road, have to make more improvements, replace plumbing inside walls and so forth. You're sure to find asbestos, things that were materials that were around when the building was first built that no one knows about, that aren't documented because they're hidden. It's just it's probably more information than you need, but it's a reality that we have to deal with in our industry, our profession.
I mean, if you take the additional $10 million that it would take to start over, have a brand new school, amortize that over 40 years, that's $250,000 a year. Are we going to be spending more or less than $250,000 a year to maintain the old part of Field? I mean, that's the financial question you got to ask yourself.
Yeah.
I'll go one beyond that. I mean, there are a lot of, take this back to a house, right? I mean, there are some really old houses that have a lot of really good character, but they have good bones and they have a good floor plate. And you got it. You take it down to the bricks and you rebuild it. But the flow, you can create the open concept, all the other stuff you want to do. And my question here is more around what are you giving up from an educational functionality standpoint by trying to work around the existing building in conjunction with the financial question that you have. But more important to our kids is just, you're trying to get our district, this is a plan to make our district future ready for decades, hopefully. And so did we do that here, or did we kind of tie one of our hands behind our back when we did it because we said we wanted to keep the middle? So I guess my question is, are the bones of the existing building good enough that if you took it down to the studs and you reworked it, maybe you spent not $10 million, but you spent another $5 redoing the plumbing and just throw a number out, but would you, or in a perfect world, is it just not functional? The layouts don't work. You're still handicapping yourself. And to Jim's point, for another 10, you get the whole thing and you scrape it.
That's a great question. And we didn't, full disclosure, we did not look at that from the get-go. We always kind of contemplate, and really because we did that simply because if you start comparing it to Lincoln, that's our benchmark, right? It is laid out much more in an organized fashion, and it is in our opinion, certainly in better shape from an infrastructure standpoint than Lincoln is. But that doesn't mean that it addresses all of your concerns or your thoughts about that building. I think there was a question by someone on the board in the last week or two, if I'm not mistaken, with regards to what is a replacement cost for that school? What does that look like? And I know that Mark has some numbers here he'd like to share with you, if it's appropriate. And with the caveat that doing that does create a whole nother conversation that we need to have about where you're staging kids, how that fits into the overall schedule of things. And that's tricky business. It's not something that we're prepared to address here, but we know that it exists. And if you want us to go down that road, that we're going to have to address.
Back to my question then, I think what you have to answer for us is from a educational delivery standpoint, what are the pluses and minuses of adding on versus starting new? What are we giving up? And then only then I think we can roll into, okay, now what would it cost? Because if we're not giving up a lot, you know, I mean, so I think we have to start with that before we, oh, new's great. Yeah, of course, but how much better? Tell me what we're giving up if we don't do it.
Exact conversation and dialogue we had with regards to Lincoln. You know, I mean, what you're talking about are the things that we wrestled with as a group for several months about that school. Whether you renovate, whether you build new, and how does that look and how does that feel? I can tell you right now, you know, certainly an ideal solution is starting from ground up, right? I mean, then you got a lot of play in terms of, you know, relations of spaces, the kinds of spaces that you create, how they address the neighborhood, and all that stuff, as opposed to building new. There's always a compromise that, as opposed to renovating and just expanding. There's always, you know, kind of a give and take that goes along with that particular solution. So I think it's something that's worth exploring. So,
I would say, well, he's coming up. We knew that Lincoln we knew we had to do that. This we knew we did. We don't have to do that. The question is, should we do that, right? And so, you know, another thing that we took into account here, we just briefly, we do address some of the academic needs and some of the safety and security needs. We get the new media space. We also, 10 years ago, just put on a new wing on this building. And, you know, one of the things that came into our thinking was, are people going to question the fact, why did you just build on a new wing 10 years ago, and now you're going to, you know, bring the whole building down and those kinds of things. So, well, I know, that's true.
We're here, we're trying not to make the same mistake.
I agree. I understand, but
and
it's
maybe a question.
It's in the back.
Yeah.
Right here.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe a question in that process we need to ask is, can we build a new school and without tearing down that 10-year-old wing? Can we build around it? Can we utilize it? Can we not?
Yeah. The simple answer is yes, you can, but it takes further study, for sure. Mark?
No, that's a good question. So Brad and I were looking at the site here. It's pretty tight. I mean, it'll be difficult. We could probably figure out a way to do it, but it's going to be a challenge to do that. It's very similar to Lincoln, where you're going to have to probably tear the building down and build new here. But we are doing this almost exact same project again down for District 111. We're tearing down a 1940s building and replacing it with a brand new school, about 80,000 square feet. So the bids from that project last May came in, and I used it for this study. And I think to replace this school, you're probably in the cost of $28 to $29 million to replace this building. And that's assuming the site is large enough to accommodate a new building, which I don't know if it is. So, so there might be costs in relocating students that you'd have to add on to that $29 million number. So it's something to think about. I think we just need to study that a little further and figure that out.
So I understand what you're saying. So it costs 28 or 29 to do a ground-up complete teardown. And when you say relocate students during the construction process or relocate some students because you won't be able to build a building that's the same size that is there now?
That's right. Yeah, we'd have to relocate the students off-site to build that building, because I think the footprint of the existing building is in the way of the new construction. We need to study that a little further, but that's what it appears to be.
I said two things, and I'm not sure which one you're agreeing with. You don't think you'd be able to whatever field's capacity is, 400 and something, whatever?
I think we have about 440 students there right now.
You wouldn't be able to build a 440 kid school?
I think what Mark is referring to, the fact that now, at the time that the school was built, the zoning regulations and all that are different than they are now. So if we're starting from scratch, we're demolishing existing building, we're going to have to abide by the new regulations, including stormwater, setbacks, building height restrictions, which I'm not sure we can do a 3-story building here or not, and that's where you might run into a problem in terms of accommodating the number of students. That I think 415 is the current capacity right now, or what you have in the school right now. So that's why we have to study it a little bit more to make sure that we give you the right answer.
All right. Now I understand. Thank you.
Yep.
We would face the similar issue at Lincoln, though, is relocating during construction, but that we could probably replicate a similar type of process for this as we do for the other one. It would just be a matter of when you get to the point where you then have the space for all-day kindergarten.
You would just delay the implementation of all-day kindergarten.
Possibly, depending on how all the staging and all the complexities of all that go.
Yeah, understood.
Some tricky stuff here.
This plan increases the enrollment ability to 500, right? Or no? Or still the same? Or just it keeps it still at 400?
You get the kindergarten classrooms, and you get the classroom where the office was.
Yeah.
And so I would say you could get 50 more kids in there probably, but most of them would be you probably couldn't get 50 total more kids in there, because you need those spaces for kindergarten. You're only really getting one extra classroom space that you don't have to account for enrollment increases, because the other space, well, actually we have 2 kindergarten rooms now, so you're getting 3 rooms. You're getting 3 extra spaces, because you could relocate where the 2 current kindergarten rooms now, and then you get the 3rd classroom space where the office is. So you don't get a lot of increased capacity for enrollment.
And one of those classrooms, I have to say, is because in this area right here, you have like this little really weird loft classroom. So it was thought that we can get those kids out of there and move them right over here. So it's 2. Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're looking at moving boundary lines and you're looking at putting additions on, greenfield sites, now's the time to look into this.
Well, you would take that on the cost.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we move to Lincoln? And so just very, very quickly over at Lincoln, kind of thinking about some of the restrictions that we had. Last time we were together, we talked a little bit about the pros and the cons of the site, and we looked at two approaches to this, to building new at Lincoln. And one of them was to relocate kids off-site during the course of construction. The first approach was to keep kids on-site and build new. And when you do that, there's some overlap that happens between the new construction and existing construction. Some inefficiencies as far as that goes, both from a staging standpoint, an implementation standpoint, and an economic standpoint that we pointed out. But really, that's kind of what we would envision here. So you can see the overlap of the gym, multi-purpose room, stage area, maybe the front entrance and so forth in that instance, if we are building on the north end of the site, which is where most of your clean square footage is on that site. And then if we look at another option where we relocate the kids off-site, and then we had, if you remember that diagram that showed kids going to Edison. We had an option where some went to Hawthorne, another went to Bryan. We had a couple different options for that. That allows ICI to get in there with all the trade contractors, tear down the building, have total and complete access to the school. And really, from our standpoint, gets us to a better position to provide an ideal footprint for you and the kids in the building. And it looks something, could look something like this. So that's the clean slate approach. And in both instances, I think as a group, we're making a recommendation that the building should stay at 2 stories. And I guess now that I'm thinking about it, zoning restrictions and guidelines in the city are going to mandate it anyhow. So really not overpowering the neighbors, but trying to, blend in with it, I guess, if you will. And that's what our approach would be, certainly with anything that we do on this site or anywhere. Yes?
Currently Lincoln and Field are both 2 stories?
Lincoln is, Lincoln's multi, yeah, kind of, but it's all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Field has a garden level, and then you go up to 2 floors above.
I'm just thinking,
would
we, if we were talking about building any more than 2 stories, are we going over the height that these 2 schools already are?
Certainly, we would. I don't think we'd be allowed to, and want to do that over at actually, no, we wouldn't. At either school, we'd probably keep it below the height that they are right now.
Okay. But in case we needed to go above, can you always ask the city for a variance?
For a variance, absolutely. Right. But that's a detail we'd have to work through.
Okay. Now, my other question is, your 2 different designs for this school, are those kind of just examples and you haven't really gone through it, or are these kind of well thought out? Well, this one is far superior to the other one for reasons that you're able to articulate?
Well, they're certainly well thought out.
And I didn't mean to imply that they weren't.
But as we said before, no, these are just examples of what could be. And we would have to go through a very extensive process, both with the staff, the community, and then ultimately presenting things to you for you to weigh in before we implemented anything. Yeah.
I do think, though, that while that entire process has to take place, and that this would not be ultimately the final design, it's obviously still an idea. We do like the concepts reflected in this idea better than the concepts reflected in the other idea. If we had to build it with the students still there and the way we would have to manipulate that.
And really the barometer for that is when we went through that process, that well thought out process, it was very apparent. We had a lot more flexibility in terms of where the main entrance wanted to be in relation to the classrooms and the gym and how the public enters it. When you start with a blank canvas, you have that luxury, right? And it just makes sense. It's logical sense, as opposed to trying to work around some of the existing structures and that you have in place because we couldn't interrupt school, and it just makes sense.
Got it. Now, what is your very well thought out capacity of this new building?
I knew you. It is. I think I want to say 400 kids.
No, it's more than that, Greg. 500. It would be a 4-section school.
Yeah.
If you were at full capacity, you'd be probably a little bit under 600 if all of your class sizes were leaning more toward the max. So you would think that if we balance out our boundaries and everything with some of these, with this comprehensive thinking, it'd probably be a few less students than it currently has. Right now it appears a lot more packed than it is too, just because the classrooms are small and the layout's bad and everything. But I think it would be somewhere between 500, 550 We wouldn't necessarily be reducing the capacity of the building. We would just have a better design.
Thank you.
Now, there are different options where, depending on what people weighed in on about the size of the buildings and how comfortable people are with moving boundaries and stuff, I mean, that could be reflected in this design, and it could be reflected in the overall cost of all the projects and things. But right now, the goal would be to keep it at about the same capacity as it currently is.
So in the grand plan, would all of our schools be 4-section schools, or would we have some 3-section schools?
They would pretty much all be 4-section schools with the exception of Jefferson. And then as we monitor dual, that would also come into effect, what the ultimate boundaries look like. But I'm going back in my head, and I just want to make sure I'm not misspeaking. Probably Jackson might not always be a full 4-section school either. This is all theoretical until we get hard numbers.
I mean, it seems like this whole thing hinges upon the community's acceptance of boundary line changes, right? I mean, until you take the temperature of the community on those changes, I mean, this whole thing's kind of up in the air, right?
Well, we would then have to revert back to doing something in a different kind of concept that people would accept, but it would probably negate the option of all-day kindergarten. One of the things as we conceive of this is the majority of the people that would end up with a boundary change would be somebody that is going to essentially a brand new school. So we thought that would be something that could potentially cushion that blow as well.
And I know you told us this before, but can you remind us from start to finish the timeline it would take to complete both the clean slate and the phased approach?
Yes, we have a schedule here. So this is okay. So for both approaches, let's go. Sorry for all that moving around. This is Lincoln School approach number 1. So that's keeping kids on site. Right? Contemplating start of design, January of 2019, or just to say some January. All the way through we're going and getting competitive pricing from contractors the following year, probably in spring. And then construction starts immediately after that, right, in the summer. And then in this instance, it would last for about 2 years. And that's reflective of the fact that the contractors are working around the kids. Yep. That's, so it kind of extends things out just a little bit. Actually, it's more than 2 years. It's 2.5 years because once the new building is built, then you demolish the existing building, and then you have some site development that needs to happen, the playgrounds, parking, and some grading issues on the remaining portions of the site. So it's about 2.5 years of construction. It's a long time. Okay, so here are some of the key dates of what I just explained, but just a different way of looking at it. So you get partial occupancy halfway through construction, right? So you build the part that there's some free land on there. That's what this, kids move into that part of the building here. And then the construction, really, demolition can't start until the following summer, right? Because you're not going to be demolishing a building when kids are on site. All right, so the second approach, which is the clean slate, does things a little differently. We have the ability to start design a little bit later, or we could just extend it out a little bit more. But really, it's the same time frame as the previous approach, about a year. And then we go out for documenting and then bidding. The building actually happens over the course of 1 year, as opposed to 2.5. And that's one of the pros, when we were going through the pros and cons, if you remember. And that translates into savings, right?
In either plan, are you starting your building at the same time?
I don't think we started it at the same time. Actually, one of the benefits is you actually start construction sooner over at Lincoln and the other plan, right? You would start designing it sooner, and then you can bid it out and get going on construction. It's just that construction needs to be extended out when the kids are on site. We have to work around it.
Got it, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so in this plan, you're actually starting construction later than
Correct.
the other plan?
Right, yes.
Which means you can borrow your money later,
Yeah.
Yes.
which means you're paying less capitalized interest on our existing debt.
That's
Thank
even
you.
another way of looking at it, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Except that you have to build Edison earlier. Lincoln and Edison are very closely.
Yeah. And there's an additional cost for the Phase 1 approach. So because you're building on site, it's about a $3 million premium because you're building over a longer period, and there's phased construction involved. So. Okay.
So the $11.6 million. The $11.6 million number that we talked about for those classrooms at Edison, if you don't do that, when you think about Lincoln, you're forced to build Lincoln without relocating the students. So that $11.6 million triggers a higher cost for option 1 at Lincoln. So so it's really 8.6 million if you think about those two different costs.
Yeah,
So that's why Lincoln and Edison are so closely intertwined.
I was thinking about it from the approach of the later we start,
Right, yeah.
the less we have to rejigger all of our current existing debt and the less capitalized interest we're going to be paying, which I would think is an advantage. And I was just thinking that's another benefit to doing the clean slate approach, but you're saying we'd have to do Edison earlier.
Right, that's, if you go back to that.
So that,
Yeah. So if we do the clean slate approach, we need to be able to relocate the students at Lincoln
Right.
to be able to clean the slate. And in order to do that, we need to have a place to put those students, which is the Edison and Bryan solution.
Right.
So those dollars would be spent somewhere else
Right.
earlier.
Got it.
Maybe not the same amount of dollars, but still, a big investment early.
Yeah, but you're saving $3 million by doing the clean slate
Correct.
versus. all right.
Correct. According to this guy.
Yes.
Putting you on the spot.
Well, technically, he did point his thumb.
So is that why, going back, is that why the planning and design in this approach comes later than the planning and design in that first?
Yes.
In the first phase?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. I think we
There's one more
reached the
thing.
end of the schools.
There's one more thing, too, before you wrap up whatever you want to talk about in relation to this. I don't know what's all on your mind, but Elizabeth wanted to address something related to what you had said about, like, the borrowing just for the maintenance, et cetera. So would you like her to just do that, or? Yeah,
That'd be
okay.
great.
Okay, so I just wanted to quickly address 2 or 3 of the questions or comments that you made. The first was about the average life of the project with the soft costs, including the technology and the furniture and all that, to make sure we're not paying for that over 25 years. And when we issue tax-exempt bonds, one of the requirements from bond counsel is that the average life of the project's finance, so that's not only the soft costs, excuse me, but the all of the costs of the physical plant, and we have to get specific average lives from the architect and construction managers and Chris, and I would work on a schedule to estimate this, to go over with bond counsel, but the average life of the bonds cannot exceed the average life of the project's financed. So that's a requirement. So for sure that won't happen. The other thing I wanted to address, and I think it's a great idea to be able to fund your maintenance over a much shorter period of time to keep your schools in better shape, especially as you have vintage buildings that will require funds in the future. And one of the best ways to do that is with the debt service extension base, which is a part of your debt service levy that is covered by the property tax limitation law, allowing you to issue bonds for things like life safety and maintenance up to a certain amount that goes back to the 1994 tax levy for that type of projects. So for the district, your debt service extension base initially was about just under $1 million. Over time, starting in 2009, it grows with CPI. Right now, you have some bonds outstanding on that debt service extension base that were issued about 5 years ago or so for life safety. Those bonds are going to mature in the next 6 years. So that debt service extension base to fund maintenance is not available right now, and that amount is relatively low because, again, it was just the property tax limitation law came into place, and they said 1994 is the year that we're pointing out. So it was really the luck of the draw, whatever you had on your outstanding bond extension in that year. So the first thing to think about is that debt service extension base is not available for another 6 years. Because CPI will have affected it, at that time, it'll be just under $1.4 million. So at that time, you could start to roll the 3-year bonds, but not until, because we've got bonds that we have to pay off before that. The other thing to think about is that to make that debt service extension base bigger and able to accommodate more of your maintenance costs is possible through a referendum to increase your debt service extension base. So, if you want to get those funds earlier, that would be a type of question, but that would be a separate question in addition to the long-term capital building bond question that you might be considering.
That's extremely helpful. So we need to put a second question on the ballot.
To do that, yes.
To do that. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm hoping we can wrap up, right? The conversation, and I'd ask the administration and consultants, can we revise this presentation based on the feedback that you've heard today?
Well, I want to make sure I understand exactly what that means, because I did hear some things. And one is that, let's see here. Might have started on a different page. I heard a lot of things. We want the web page where we want everything consolidated into one place, which we can do. Secondly, we want the abbreviations and different things on those slides. We want to make sure that we indicate what that means and what they're for. But you just want a simple version of that. You don't want an extensive breakout of everything, right? Okay, so we can do that. Are you writing this down? Come on, handler. Okay, and then we want to be able to articulate to people that. What's that?
She's the handler.
Yeah. And then we want to make sure that when we present this, we explain to the public that water remediation is included in the site improvements in the overall plan, right? I heard that. We want to try to start to get some explanation of the comparisons between when we would have to start putting money into our regular existing buildings and how that compares against the overall cost of this project and the overall maintenance dollars that we're talking about for our existing needs. But I heard a couple comments to that effect, and they were stated in like 3 or 4 different times, and they were each a little bit different. So that one, I want to make sure I'm clear what you want. Like when we communicate and start putting this dollar against this dollar, and what does that mean? I heard about 3 or 4 different statements to that effect, and I want to make sure that we're giving you what you're asking for.
I can clarify when I spoke about this. Like, for example, for Lincoln, it was listed under building specific and maintenance. There was about $22 million. How long would that those kinds of needs or fixes last versus the $32 million of a new school? So I'd like to look at some time frames too, the life cycle of what we're doing. Else want to clarify that or add?
Chris, I think, made a comment along these lines. It was slightly different than just specific to Lincoln.
Yeah, I mean, we know what our long-term, what room we have in our long-term budget earmarked for maintenance.
Oh, that's what it was.
And so, you know, if we do this, does this get it down to the $1.5 million that we have in maintenance, or does it also, you know, help with freeing up some of those funds? But it's, you know, what does the 10-year maintenance plan look like in these scenarios?
And I think we got that information in our conversation. That's where that $14 million out of $35 million came into play, and we're just asking that it would be included into the presentation. Is that what we're asking? Because we got that answer.
Well, I think that's another facet of it.
Correct.
I think we can revise some of these slides to reflect some of these things, but I think we need a separate document of some kind that starts to boil down these cost comparison things, I think.
I mean, rolling this up to where we kind of started that conversation out of principle, which is, I think, I mean, you got to make it simple, and you got to have 3 to 5 selling points for this whole thing if you're going to communicate it. And one of them is just we go to a T-shirt, that you're going to get a set of buildings in a school district facility-wise that's going to last you for 20, 25 years, 30 years. That's the same. We fixed all the problems. We've modernized the facilities. Based upon our best guess view of the future of education at Elmhurst, this should put us in good stead for the next X number of years. Here's what you're getting. And so in order to say that, we better make sure that everything we have to fix is in that number. And like these guys said, there's always going to be ongoing maintenance, even if you had a brand new building. And then that's where the 10-year plan comes out. But I don't think you can leave, you know, some of these projects out of this number. Correct. Because you can't say, well, we're going to fix Lincoln, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that. I think you got to be able to say, we're fixing every building in this district and really putting the community in a position to have, you know, future-ready schools for the next, we believe, we're going to be the next, pick it, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I get what you're saying now. So we include that, we show how we're setting people up, how long their investment is lasting, and how that allows us to have the money we need to be able to finance our existing maintenance that will continue to occur over time in some of these other buildings that aren't getting the major attention, or different things like that. So yes, I think I understand what you're asking. So it should be, we can do that.
Other updates you had?
Well, that's what I kind of captured. I mean, we did talk about a lot of these different things where I think people got a better understanding of the thinking that went into what we were doing or trying to come up with here for a first shot at this. But it's in terms of what you exactly want captured in terms of kind of a communication document or a consolidated summary document of some kind. If I didn't indicate that in these couple things I rattled off here, then I would appreciate it if you tell me so I know, and then we'll make sure we address it.
This doesn't have to be in the communication document, but one thing I will ask our building experts again is just to think about our buildings that were built in the 1950s. And what needs do you think they'll have between now and the time the debt that we're asking for is paid off? I just don't want to leave a future school board with a major headache and boxed in financially. Yeah.
These have to get fixed during the term of the bonds so that the next time we need money, you'll have the capacity to go get it.
Right.
Yeah. I think the other item too was field school, looking more extensively at that construction project.
Yeah, I think that I saw Mark was making some notes over there. I assume that we'll be able to get a little more detailed information on that.
I just wanted, maybe you can address this even with a slide, how all-day kindergarten, why it is part of the facilities plan. I mean, like, because it really is, it affects all these decisions. So, and why is all-day kindergarten something that if you don't have kids going to kindergarten, why is that either important or not important? What is, because we all want to sell our houses, and what are, just think there's educational pieces, there's facility pieces. So I just think that it's important the community understand why that's a part of this discussion. So.
We can do that, and we really have a lot of that we would just incorporate into these conversations, so we'll do that. Susan is chairing an all-day kindergarten curriculum committee, and they're going to convene in about a week. And what we would like to do in May is have a presentation for the board to show the board what all-day kindergarten looks like, because I think some people don't know what that means, and there's the comment on one side of the spectrum that it's just a babysitting service, and then there's a comment on the other side of the spectrum that you're trying to jam academics down little kids' throats all day long, and neither one of those is true. So what we want to do is show you, what the curriculum standards look like, what a sample schedule of a day would look like, how that would be incorporated throughout the year, and how we can do things in that full day model that we're compromised to do now. So you'll be getting some of that information soon.
And also the cost alternatives if you don't do full day kindergarten. The idea being that you have to bring kids to where they would be if they didn't have full-day kindergarten.
And if we're going to full-day kindergarten, can we get some world language in there when kids are most ready to learn and most easily learn a new language? Well, we seem to have some extra time in the day to do that then.
Well, we have this thing called dual now, if you remember. But no, I understand what you're saying, and that is a good point. That's an interesting point. We are looking at time and how we allocate time at the elementary levels right now for a variety of reasons. So.
And I guess when I'm hearing all of these revisions, and to me what stands out is that this is very much a draft. And it's going to continue to be a draft until we get it to the community. Is that a clear statement? Okay. So with that in mind, my thought is we spent a lot of time on the what. And it's for a draft, a very well thought out draft, but it's for a draft. I hope we spend as much time going through how we're going to communicate this, how we're going to get feedback, how we're going to get these new ideas generated, and how these ideas are going to be synthesized. Because we spent a lot of time on what for a draft, which will undoubtedly be updated and changed once it goes out to the community.
Okay, so for Tuesday then, we'll talk about the how, the communication process. And I know there's two board members won't be there Tuesday? Okay. Oh, did you just want to say something?
Yeah, because I can't be there. I'm going to be in Boston. We're actually opening a new theater that we built and contracted and dealt with all of this on. And we're actually showing movies now, so it's exciting. I just wanted to express some thoughts here while I'm not going to be here for the how conversation. And Margaret, it echoes a lot of what you're talking about. And I think there's a couple points in my mind as we set this up. Number one, I think a lot of people say community, and community is a big word that doesn't exist. We have 44,000 people in this town. They all don't think the same way. They all have different interests, concerns, fears, wants. And so I think the risk in this process of community engagement is not breaking that apart into the smaller pieces that it necessarily needs to be and be addressed. And to Margaret's point, we don't have the plan, we have a plan. And the community is not going to tell us. Different pieces of the community that are impacted by this, that are part of this, are going to tell us things, similar to the way we went through each building. And you're going to get, proceed, I think it looks good. You're going to get modified, but not bad, but I need these, or you missed a few things, or it's going to be start over. To Jim's point, I don't think you can have that conversation without a boundary conversation, because it's just such a big part of a first decision. Which leads then into the communication piece. And I just see this as so iterative because of where we are with this thing. It ranges from, I think we have informal to formal. We have open-ended and free-form to structured. We have a micro issues around schools to a macro issue around how we fund it and how the community puts it all together. And I think this is necessarily going to take time, and we can't put a time box around it. It has to organically grow. And so, I think that, first and foremost, let's start with the communities that are the most impacted in Elmhurst. Lincoln School, obviously being the first one. I think we've got some great stuff out here, well thought out plans to start that conversation. And why wouldn't we go, before we launch into a formal process and a community advisory team, and why wouldn't we go to the Lincoln community and sit down with, hey guys, this is what's going to happen to your kids if we do this. What did we miss? How could we make this plan better before we show this to somebody that's not been paying attention? And the field community as well, the Edison community, the Madison community, the folks that are going to be impacted by boundaries. We don't need a ton of consultants to figure that out initially, because it's not a formal process yet. I think informally we should be polling people so that we don't get too far down the road formally and find out that we need to restart this thing. And also from a financial standpoint, it doesn't cost us a lot of money to have an open house, town hall, something at Lincoln. With that community, we have spent a lot of money, and these guys have spent a ton of time giving us that anchor for that conversation. And so I would expect us to have this conversation again after those. But I don't want a bunch of surveys coming back. I mean, me personally, I don't need a bunch of surveys coming back at this point before the community advisory team gets it. I'd love to see a bunch of community meetings with these smaller communities in Elmhurst, and you guys come back and we do this again with that feedback, and it's more open-ended. And then we get to a more formal process of trying to gel this into a plan that could become the plan. I guess that's my point. I just don't want to kind of take a straight line where we're going to meetings with feedback and more meetings and focus groups, and we spend a bunch of money on glossy brochures and mailings and things like that, and we find out that that's not, I think we can very quickly figure out what we missed.
No, I think that those things are part of a later process when you get a ballot initiative, you get something on a ballot. Some of those things that you're talking about, but they're also, I'm talking like the brochures and stuff like that that you were talking about, and those surveys and other things like that would also come later on in the process when we know what types of questions we're trying to ask people to get more scientific and specific information. What you said is exactly what has been tentatively planned, which is to talk about some of these very specific issues with the Lincoln people, like, for example, how we would handle the transition year, what their preferences might be around housing students, And in fact, we're surveying and should have some information pretty soon with the kindergarten and first grade students, how many of those families have younger siblings that might be affected by having to be in multiple sites at once, potentially. And so we would talk to them even more specifically because they would be the ones affected. So these are what you're suggesting about these smaller targeted conversations are incorporated in the first steps of the process.
I guess my point is I don't feel like we need a communication consultant to help us figure out how to talk to our constituents. That we did it with the middle school day. We had a learning and teaching committee meeting, and then we had a foundation sponsored, or PTA council sponsored open house where folks talked. I mean, these are things that you could do next week with the content that these guys have already provided. And we could really accelerate the iteration in the process without waiting for some formal communication consultant to help us package. I don't want to package. I want to give them the options that we've just debated and have them have the same debate. And then get into, how do you start to, at some point we do have to get it into a package, but I don't think we're there yet.
Like Chris, I won't be here Tuesday. I'll be in New York, and fortunately I won't be watching any movies, but I guess we'll both be on the East Coast. But, to echo Chris's comments, every Focus 205 meeting I went to, as Margaret said earlier, people said, these are good ideas, but you're asking me to make a decision. You're asking me for my opinion without being able to put it in context of how does it affect my property tax bill. So I think it would be pretty easy to have another Focus 205, whatever you want to call it, but a Focus 205 format meeting. Be able to say, hey, this is what you asked for. You asked for what does this stuff cost, and just have a did we get it right check. Here's what all-day kindergarten costs, and here's the plan to implement all-day kindergarten that we think would be the most cost-effective way of implementing it. What do you think about that? This is what it adds to the price of the property tax bill of a house in Elmhurst, and let them multiply and do their own math to make it fit their house, and get feedback from what we determined. And I think also, as to be fair and to give people as much information as possible, we need to tell people that of our comparison districts, here are the number that offer all-day kindergarten. And, we'll leave it to the community to decide how that affects their house value. Is someone choosing another community over Elmhurst just for all-day kindergarten? I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know if there's a way to get an answer to that. I'd reach out to the real estate community in Elmhurst and ask what they hear. But I'd like to go back to the whoever is interested enough to show up format. And now that we have some price estimates.
That was also one of the first next steps that we had talked about, is to have a night like that just focusing on finances.
And to me, I heard a couple of options. I heard an option before that talked about going to the Lincoln school as an example, going to the Lincoln families and asking them, what are your thoughts on some of these items? I heard that option prior to going to a large community type group. This to me are some of the questions, issues that could be flushed out or should be flushed out, and whenever we hear about whatever this communication plan will be, those are the types of things that need to be included in how we are going to move forward and what questions we are going to be asking who. So I think that is a really important part. Another piece that we talked about was, even before we go to whether we can move forward, will people even be interested? This is a community-wide issue. Will people even be interested in this, given that there are potential boundary changes? That's a big question before we move forward on any of these other answers. So I think some of those questions need to be included so we can understand and make sure we've captured all those big pieces as we begin to move forward. And that's why I keep harping on this communication plan. We do what really, really well. We do it really well. We have great ideas, and we put all the effort in to get those ideas implemented well. And what I don't want to happen is that people don't understand what we did or why we did it.
And to your point, too, I don't think you can answer the financial question, the how do we pay for it question, until you know what we're paying for. If you go to the Lincoln community and they say there's no way our kids are moving off site, you have to do it on site. That changes the sequence of things versus them coming and saying, yes, go ahead, scrape the thing, we'll put up with the disruption. That's the feedback we want so that we can start taking some options off the table and actually pricing a scenario, because we don't have that yet. I mean, if field, if what we talked about today, if we end up scraping field and rebuilding it, what's that do? Because we just talked about the sequences of where we would build things and when we would need money. Because it is a big deal, because phasing is going to be huge, particularly given that we're going to pay off our debt in the 2024-2025 timeframe. And so you really could do this without raising taxes. If you did it now, there's some capitalized interest that have some significant impact. There's a lot of things we can move on the financial side. We just need to know what we're solving for. But until we get some really quick feedback from the Lincoln families, the Field families, the Edison families, as to whether we blew it, I don't think it's worth spending time on a lot of bond scenarios.
But Chris, take a look at it this way. If the community comes back and says, you know what, thanks, but no thanks on all-day kindergarten, if the community says no thanks, that option of relocating the Lincoln kids or the Field kids while you do construction on their school is no longer part of the plan.
Yeah, that's another one of the big questions, right? A big question is how do the Lincoln people want to address, I guess the most impacted communities within our community should be addressed first. The all-day kindergarten question is obviously something that this is underpinned 100% on. The Lincoln community's reaction to the relocation options is another critical piece of that. And so those are big go, no-go kind of, critical fatal flaws that may or may not be in there.
And I think one thing this discussion has proven is we have some very complex ideas that, I'd like to think I'm paying attention, that I didn't grasp the first time it was presented to me. And now that we've had a better discussion and I understand the details make far more sense. We need to be able to make sure that we can communicate succinctly and clearly to the community what the existing plan is, put it out there as a straw man, and say, how would you make this better?
I'll put another layer of complexity out there too. I mean, for instance, like I'm a Lincoln parent, but my kids wouldn't be affected by this. So it's people that have younger kids that would be affected that we might not, you have to reach them too. Because it's 4 years away. Something that's 4 years away, let's do, for example, is, it wouldn't affect the entire school community. Yeah.
And the other crucial thing is people need an idea of where those new boundary lines would be. A Lincoln parent that may not be in the Lincoln district anymore may have a different opinion.
Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to, I said I would do this because the meeting was so long. Are there any other public comments from people?
There's a hand.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Just a few things that I'd ask that you all think about. One is, if we go to the ballot with this referendum and it passes, and then, $100, $200 million, whatever, and then what happens if we have to fund pensions that right now the state is funding? It seems like when we talk a lot about spending money, that question comes up, but it's not coming up in this discussion. So I want to make sure that we're thinking about possibly being on the hook for a whole lot of money for pensions. So that was one thing. The second thing was related to transportation. And I don't know the answers to these, so I'm just kind of laying them out there of things that I hope that at least get discussed. If they get discounted, fine, but at least get discussed. How would boundary changes affect transportation, long-term and short-term? Would it mean that people are needing to be bused who don't currently be bused, and that's obviously an ongoing cost? And also the temporary thing. Obviously, if fifth grade is going to Bryan, that's going to be more people busing to Bryan. If people are being bused from Lincoln to Hawthorne, that's more people being bused to Hawthorne. So I think we need to look at the busing costs, but we also, oh my gosh, I see so many comments from parents about drop-off and pickup already at Hawthorne and Bryan. And if we're adding 4 sections to each of those schools, that's potentially another 100 families at each of those schools, right? 4 sections times 25 kids. Just think about what that could do to drop off and pick up for the ones who aren't being bused, or for the parents who decide to pick up. Just, you know, the road rage of drop off and pick up and that sort of thing that already exists without those extra people. And then just some kind of thoughts of, you know, as we move people to these 3 different schools, as we move Lincoln to, you know, Edison and Hawthorne and Bryan, what does that do to their school unity, their school cohesion, their PTA? You know, are they still Lincoln people, or are they, for a short amount of time, Edison people? Just kind of wondering about those. And then a comment related to the additional security cameras in and around the various buildings and who would monitor them. I know that's kind of a different conversation, but it was part of the conversation. I mean, I was in Sandberg's main office yesterday morning, and there was one person in there who was trying to give us, you know, our badges and answering multiple phone calls, and I could see the security cameras, and I'm like, nobody's monitoring them. So I think if we're really talking about adding additional security cameras, does that mean we're adding a security person who's monitoring all those cameras at all those places? And yes, we need security, absolutely. But I think we need to think about what that means, because I think we can't say, well, somebody can pull it up on their computer. Or, yeah, I think we just need to be realistic about what we're already asking those people to do every day. And being security guards is not one of them. I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, we have 2 upcoming meetings. Next Tuesday, regularly scheduled board meeting, February 27th, 7:30. And March, we have 1 regularly scheduled board meeting, March 20th, 7:30. We've reached the end of the agenda. I'll declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you all.